In history, there are cages not forged from iron. They do not rattle when they close. They leave no noticeable marks on the wrists. They operate so quietly that a person can live an entire lifetime inside them and believe that this is simply the natural air of the world. Slavery in the United States, Jim Crow laws, and the apartheid regime. At first glance, 3 different stories in 3 eras across 3 landscapes. But if we listen slowly enough, we hear a shared rhythm. Architectures of power designed not only to control bodies, but to imprison imagination, training the oppressed to believe that no other world could exist. Perhaps what we think we know about freedom is also mistaken. Freedom is not only an open door. Sometimes it is the moment you realize you have lived too long in a room without windows, and that what is called order is merely a habit constructed to keep you from asking questions. This story begins with people who appear very different, yet converge at the same point of origin. Ordinary human beings thrown into adversity, time stretching suffering into endurance, and a decisive element, knowledge, moral conscience, or inner discipline that opens a path to change. Frederick Douglass was born without a name in a system built to erase memory. Martin Luther King Jr. grew up in a divided city where signs legalized injustice. Nelson Mandela carried 2 names, lived between 2 worlds, and learned to enter a system to dismantle it from within. What you think you know about them as finished symbols may be incomplete. Before they became symbols, they were people who were trapped, who doubted, who grew weary, who learned how to stand upright in spaces designed to make people bow. This video from Deep Sleep of Power invites you to slow down, to step inside that invisible cage and see how it works, and how 3 lives cracked it open. If this storytelling rhythm helps you settle and reflect, consider supporting the channel so we can continue sharing these quiet stories of power, memory, and human dignity. And now, let us begin at the lowest point of the cage, where a human being is born without a name. Because sometimes the journey to change the world starts with reclaiming what seems smallest of all, the right to be called human. Some people enter life with a long-awaited name, a carefully recorded birthday, and a story that begins within the memory of a family. But there are also those who arrive in this world as an absence. Frederick Douglass belonged to the latter. He did not come into life through a calling, but through silence. No exact date of birth, no father, no past permitted to exist. This absence was not accidental, nor was it a mistake of history. It was part of the design. Within the system of slavery, anonymity was not a consequence. It was a tool. When a person does not know who they are, society finds it easier to decide that they do not need to be anyone at all. No name means no history. No history means no claim upon the future. Frederick Douglass was not born into a family. He was born into a mechanism that treated the human body as property to be bought and sold, and human memory as a danger to be erased. A name in that world was not meant for affection, but for management. And if management could function without names, then it was better that no one be allowed to have one. A child who grows up unattached to any current of memory slowly learns to exist like a breathing object. The silence surrounding Douglass's early life was not peaceful. It was heavy, deliberate, and sustained by rules that needed no explanation because everyone understood them. His mother was forced to labor on a different plantation, dozens of miles away. This separation was not born of scarcity, but of strategy. Under slavery, Motherhood was treated as a threat, because where there is love, there is dignity, and where there is dignity, power begins to lose control. The deliberate division of mother and child became a method of emotional governance designed to prevent, at its root, the human capacity to imagine a different kind of life. Douglas did not remember lullabies, nor the familiar touch of a hand upon his forehead. He retained only a vague sensation that someone had once been present, briefly, quietly. That very fragility became his first proof of something essential, that the world does not have to be built on fear. When a small memory manages to survive within darkness, it inadvertently establishes a measure between what is natural and what is merely imposed order. The system of slavery functioned efficiently not only through violence, but through narrative. It told the governed that things had always been this way, that their position was self-evident, that injustice was part of the natural order. And when a child grows up without a name, that story seeps in more easily because there is no memory strong enough to argue back. Yet every architecture of power contains a blind spot. Human beings possess the capacity to compare. Even without literacy, without articulated language, people can sense the dissonance between what exists and what ought to exist. Douglas sensed that the silence enveloping his life was not like the quiet of nightfall, but like a silence that had been staged. This feeling was not yet resistance, not yet thought, only a fragile intuition that something about his world was not entirely correct. Later in life, Douglas would say that there were moments when he wished he had never learned to read. For knowledge, when it touches a captive mind, does not bring peace. It brings painful clarity. But before learning to read, he had already learned something more profound, that his lack of a name was not fate, but a decision imposed from the outside. The moment a person realizes that what they have called normal is in fact a constructed system, the invisible cage begins to show its first cracks. A person may be stripped of a name, but if somewhere deep within they still retain the sense that they were meant to have one, then history is not yet finished. The beginning of Frederick Douglass's life held no myth, no applause, only an unnamed child growing up in a world deliberately designed to make him forget that he was human. And yet from that lowest point, another journey began, slowly and quietly, through the formation of a question both small and dangerous. If I have no name, then who took it away? And once that question takes root, the cage, however invisible, can no longer remain intact. Elsewhere, in a city called Atlanta, another child was growing up amid the unseen boundaries of an order known as law, where separation required no whips, yet still possessed the power to shape an entire life. But that is the rhythm of the following passage, as the story moves from chains to signs, from bondage to boundaries made legitimate. Atlanta in 1929 was a city fluent in 2 languages at once. One was written into the Constitution, echoed in speeches, and repeated in promises of freedom. The other was etched into space, onto signs, pathways, and doorways, spoken softly, yet obeyed without question. Martin Luther King Jr. entered the world within this duality, where freedom was celebrated in words and narrowed in everyday practice. For a child, the world first appears not as ideology, but as a map. King grew up in a city divided by rules that seemed self-evident: which parks one could enter, which water fountains one could use, which libraries one was allowed to cross into. The signs reading "Whites Only" required no explanation. They had stood long enough to become part of the landscape. And when a landscape repeats itself every day, it slowly comes to be called the natural order. The system of racial segregation operated differently from chains. It did not bind the body with iron, but with habit. It taught people how to adjust their steps, lower their voices, and choose detours to avoid confrontation. A child learned how to prevent before learning how to ask. And it was precisely this silent education that made the cage harder to see. Black churches and white churches in Atlanta stood only a few blocks apart, yet were separated by a historical distance too deep to be bridged by individual goodwill. Two communities breathed the same air, heard the same evening bells, yet were arranged never to truly meet as equals. The separation was not loud. It repeated itself steadily, long enough to seep into the very sense of what was considered normal. For King, early life meant coexisting with a quiet paradox. His family emphasized education, discipline, and dignity. Inside the home, he was taught that he had worth. Outside, the city taught a different lesson, that this worth had limits. The tension between these two lessons did not erupt into anger. It accumulated into a silent unease, like a musical note that never quite resolves, lingering in the mind. The moment that made the fracture visible did not come through violence, but through a closed door. A white friend King had once played with suddenly disappeared. There was no lengthy explanation, only a short sentence. Because you are black. For a child, that sentence carried no logic, only pain. It transformed an abstract concept into a personal experience. From that moment on, segregation was no longer distant signs. It reached the heart, leaving behind a scar both thin and deep. What is striking is that King's response did not slide into hatred. Pain did not turn into a desire for revenge, but into a question. Why? A question seemingly simple, yet capable of eroding any architecture of power. Every system remains strong when people obey, and begins to weaken the moment people ask for reasons. That question grew with King, accompanying him through school, through theological study, through the pages of history books. The Jim Crow system did not need to oppress King every day. It only needed to make him accustomed to separation. When injustice is repeated long enough, it risks becoming background. But it was precisely the small experiences, a closed door, a blocked path, that prevented King from accepting that background. They reminded him that the existing order was not the only possible order. Atlanta taught King a lesson about space, that power can be inscribed into geography. But it also taught him another lesson, quieter and more subtle, that space can be redefined by voice. As he began to engage in debate, the strength of reason revealed itself as a new pathway. Words, when used calmly and precisely, could bridge distances that bodies were forbidden to cross. Within Atlanta's divisions, King learned how to listen. He listened to the pain of his community, to sermons about love and justice, and even to the silence of forbidden spaces. This listening shaped a distinctive rhythm, slow, deep, unhurried. It prepared him to transform sorrow into language, and a personal question into a collective call. If the first part of this story is about a human being born without a name, then this part is about a human being growing up amid names that were classified. Not chains, but signs. Not whips, but rules. The system of racial segregation taught King that power could be soft, and precisely because it was smooth, it could endure. But it also inadvertently taught him that what is built through habit can be dismantled through awareness. When night falls over Atlanta, the city grows quiet. In that quiet, the boundaries remain, but they make less noise. It is in such moments of stillness that the question why continues to whisper, waiting to be answered by a path that creates no further suffering. Elsewhere, half a world away, another child is learning his first lesson in having his name replaced, another variation of the same architecture of power. And the story, slowly, will lead us there, to the place where two worlds collide within a single human being. Before becoming a name spoken with reverence around the world, Nelson Mandela was Rolihlahla, a child growing up within the slow, steady rhythm of the village of Mvezo. There, power was not displayed through commands, but practiced through listening. In the councils of the Thembu community, a leader did not speak first, but last, only after every voice had been heard. For the young Rolihlahla, order was not something imposed, but something earned through patience. No one was hurried aside. Every voice had its place within the shared circle. That world was not perfect, but it taught a fundamental sense of belonging, that one had a place here, that one's voice, however small, still mattered. In that rhythm of life, identity did not need to be proven. It existed as naturally as the ground beneath one's feet and the sky overhead. It was a world where names were not merely labels, but bonds, connecting individuals to the flow of community and memory. But when Rolihlahla entered a colonial school, another world opened, neater, more orderly, and colder. Everything there was arranged for ease of management. Language, lessons, forms of address, all were shaped by the convenience of the system. And in a moment that seemed almost trivial, he was given a new name, Nelson. Easier to pronounce, easier to record, easier to file away. A stroke of a pen, a procedure, a change so quiet it made no sound. Yet a change of name is never merely a change of syllables. It is a reminder that a power stands above you, confident enough to decide who you will be called. For Mandela, that moment marked the first clear fracture in his sense of self. Rolihlahla, the name carrying the memory of the village and its circular gatherings, suddenly had to share space with Nelson, the name of the classroom, of discipline, of an order that did not ask for consent. The apartheid system did not enter the boy's life all at once through harsh laws. At first, it arrived through subtle classifications. Who sat where, who learned what, who was expected to become what kind of person. Discrimination did not need to shout. It whispered long enough for people to adjust their behavior themselves. Mandela grew up between two parallel worlds, one that taught him to listen and another that taught him to obey. Both had order, but only one treated human beings as ends in themselves. The other treated them as means. This tension did not erupt into a crisis. It accumulated slowly, like two currents flowing side by side within the same person. Mandela learned how to move between them, preserving the composure of Rolihlahla in a world that demanded he become Nelson. This ability, not to lose oneself, yet not to deny reality, would later become a crucial survival skill. To challenge a system built on rules, one must first understand those rules from the inside. Apartheid, at its core, was an architecture of power designed to separate people from one another and from themselves. It divided not only living spaces, but futures. Who was allowed to learn, who was allowed to dream, who was permitted to believe they could go beyond their assigned place. Mandela witnessed this not through a single dramatic event, but through the steady repetition of small limits. Each limit, on its own, seemed reasonable. Stacked together, they formed an invisible wall. Within that separation, Mandela did not learn resentment. He learned observation. He watched how power operates when it is confident it will not be challenged. He saw that the system relied not only on force, but on the habit of acceptance. When people grow accustomed to being placed into boxes, they begin to shrink themselves to fit. This realization came early, planting a quiet question within him. Is it possible to step into the box without allowing it to define who you are? Living with two names taught him an essential lesson in strategy. Sometimes, to change a structure, one must first learn its language, not to assimilate, but to understand how it justifies its own existence. Mandela studied diligently, approached the law, and gradually entered spaces the system believed it had under control. On the outside, he was Nelson, proper, compliant, procedural. On the inside, Rolihlahla continued to listen, to remember, and to wait. Two worlds within one person did not cancel each other out. They created a rare depth. Mandela understood the value of order without confusing order with justice. He understood the strength of discipline without trading it for blind obedience. This fragile balance kept him from sliding into extremism, even when confronting an extreme system. If, in earlier parts, we saw a person born without a name and another growing up amid dividing signs, here we witness a person learning to live with two identities within a single body. The apartheid system attempted to sever Mandela from his roots, but in doing so, it inadvertently forged his ability to walk between worlds, an ability that would later become essential when he was forced to negotiate with those who had imprisoned him. As night fell over Mvezo and the colonial classrooms grew silent, the two names continued to coexist within his mind. Not in conflict, not merged, but simply moving alongside one another. And within that parallel movement, an awareness began to form that dismantling an architecture of power requires more than anger. It requires knowledge, discipline, and a weapon far less visible: the ability to transform personal experience into systematic understanding. From these early experiences, the seed of consciousness was planted. But consciousness alone is not enough to change the world. It must be nurtured, sharpened, and turned into a tool. In the chapters that follow, we will see three human beings, each in his own way, begin to forge their silent weapons: knowledge, law, and philosophy, preparing for the confrontations that could no longer be avoided. In the world of slavery, there were things forbidden not because they were dangerous, but because they reminded people that they were still human. Motherhood was one of them. Love between mother and child did not need to be crushed by whips. Distance, time, and systematically arranged exhaustion were enough. Frederick Douglass grew up inside that void, a childhood without steady embraces, without evenings of storytelling, without a continuous memory of someone calling him by an intimate name. His mother was forced to work on a different plantation, dozens of miles away. That separation was not an accident of circumstance, but an intention of power. For when mother and child are kept apart, memory becomes fragmented. And when memory fragments, dignity struggles to find shelter. A child unaccustomed to being held soon learns how to exist without expecting tenderness. This is how the invisible cage closes, not through violence, but through a prolonged absence. Yet there are things that do not obey the schedules of power. At night, when labor had ended and surveillance loosened, Douglass's mother walked in silence. She crossed dark dirt roads, endured exhaustion and danger, simply to stand beside her child's bed while he slept. She did not come to speak. She did not come to stay. She came only to be present, That brief presence for a child was all that remained of another world, a world not built on fear. Douglas did not remember his mother's voice. The memory was too fragile to retain sound. He remembered only the sense that someone had been there, in the night, very quietly. That feeling carried no clear image, yet it was enough to create an inner anchor. Within a system determined to erase every natural bond, that silent presence became an act of resistance without declaration. It did not break the rules. It shattered the assumption that love could be fully managed. Motherhood in this story is not a sentimental detail added for effect. It is an early psychological lesson. Douglas learned that some things do not require legalization in order to exist. Some bonds do not need permission to have value. When a mother accepts the risk of walking through the night simply to watch her child sleep, she is saying, without words, that her child deserves love, regardless of whatever name the world assigns him. That faint memory laid the foundation for an inner measure. It gave Douglas a rare capacity, the ability to distinguish between what is natural and what is imposed. Whips, surveillance, and anonymity could be called order, but they did not resemble the brief peace of a night in which a mother was present. This quiet comparison, though not yet a fully formed awareness, preserved the human core within him from being completely worn away. The slave system understood the power of love very well, and precisely because it understood, it sought to prevent it. Separating families not only reduced the likelihood of rebellion, it reduced the capacity to dream. The child who never witnesses sustained care will struggle to believe that he deserves a different future. But Douglas's mother, through her nocturnal journeys, secretly planted another seed in her child's mind. That dignity is not something bestowed. It is something that can be preserved, even when no one is watching. That memory did not turn Douglas into a rebel overnight. It did not produce rage. Instead, it gave rise to a deep, quiet, enduring sorrow. That sorrow did not seek eruption. It sought survival. And it was precisely the persistence of that sorrow that enabled him to endure, to observe, and to learn. In psychology, there are memories that do not need to be clearly recalled to exert a lasting influence. They function like underground currents, shaping emotion and decision over many years. As Douglas grew older and began to grasp the nature of the system imprisoning him, the memory of his mother in the night became an inner proof that the world was not always as cold as its rules demanded it be. That proof did not erase suffering, but it prevented suffering from becoming the only truth. It reminded him that behind every architecture of power, there remain small acts that refuse submission, acts that do not collapse the system, but reveal its limits. The first act of resistance in Douglas's life was not learning to read, not running away, but the fact that he had once been loved in a world that forbade love. This created a dangerous paradox for power. How do you convince a person that they are unworthy when they have already felt, if only once, that they have value? That question was not spoken aloud, but it was there, quietly waiting to be named. When the night ended, and his mother left before dawn, Douglas's world returned to its familiar rules. But something had changed. Inside the invisible cage, there was now an empty space, a space where dignity had once existed. That space did not disappear. Followed him through the years that came after, becoming the ground upon which other seeds of awareness would take root. In the sections that follow, we will see that those seeds did not come only from maternal love, but also from other wounds, friendships forbidden, identities divided, personal experiences that touched the flesh, transforming abstract injustice into questions that could not be ignored. And from those questions, something more substantial than emotion would gradually take shape. Awareness, forged into a tool ready to enter a long confrontation with power. For a child, the world begins as a game. Anything can become a companion, a pebble, a leaf, a yard, a burst of laughter. Children have not yet learned to fear boundaries, because in their minds, boundaries are merely chalk lines that can be stepped over. And so, when Martin Luther King Jr. was very young, friendship came to him not as a social issue, but as something natural. He played with a white child who lived nearby, running together, laughing together, sharing ordinary afternoons. At that age, skin color was not a definition. It was simply a detail of light. But Atlanta was not a city that allowed children to preserve their innocence for long. Under Jim Crow laws, segregation did not need to appear as overt violence. It only required to intrude at precisely the right moment, early enough, sharp enough, to split a sense of safety in two. And that moment arrived in the simplest possible form. The door of friendship was closed. One day, the other child was no longer allowed to play with King. There was no argument, no misunderstanding, no reason that belonged to children. The reason came from adults, brief, cold, and delivered as if it required no explanation at all, because he is black. A single sentence, yet as heavy as a verdict. For a child, it was the first realization that some rules have nothing to do with right or wrong, and everything to do with power. The door that closed that day did more than end a game. It opened a hollow space within King's mind, a quiet zone where questions began to take root. In psychology, there are moments that shape the structure of a life, not because they are dramatic, but because they alter how we trust the world. King had believed that friendship was natural, and then, in the span of one afternoon, he learned that natural could be rewritten by a system larger than a child's heart. What matters is that King's response did not follow the path the system typically expects. Injustice often produces two kinds of silence, the silence of acceptance and the silence of hatred. But in King, the pain took another form, the silence of thought. He was sad, wounded, but he did not seek revenge. Instead, a persistent, almost childlike question arose within him. Why? And it is precisely this question that is dangerous to every architecture of power, for power is strongest when people believe it requires no explanation. Why is an open question. It does not search for someone to hate. It searches for a structure to understand. When a child asks why, they are seeking a cause. When an adult retains that question, they are seeking a path. King carried this question for a long time, and so the first wound of the heart did not close like an ordinary cut. It became a line etched into the soul, guiding him toward books, sermons, and debates about justice. Jim Crow laws did not only divide schools or water fountains, they divided the human psyche. They taught black people to constantly ask themselves whether they were standing too close to a boundary. They taught white people that those boundaries were normal, necessary to defend. And so, when friendship was forbidden, it was not merely the decision of one family. It was the system protecting itself by severing the bonds that might allow people to see one another as human. From a child's perspective, that prohibition was painfully illogical. Yet it was precisely this illogic that planted a distinct awareness within King that some things are called law without truly being justice. Unlike Douglas, who learned about power through anonymity and deprivation, King learned about power through legalized separation. One cage was sealed by violence and silence. The other was drawn with lines and signs, but both shared the same purpose: to make people believe they had no right to cross. In the years that followed, as King grew up within the worlds of church and education, that wound did not disappear. It changed shape. It became a heightened sensitivity to moments when people were rejected without moral cause. It trained his attention on details others might overlook: averted gazes, lowered voices, the quiet shame of being forced to enter through the back door. King gradually understood that racism was not only the act of the malicious, it was a social habit, taught early and repeated long enough for people to mistake it for truth. Here, we encounter a gentle paradox. That very wound made King softer, not harder. It did not produce a man who sought to reclaim through force, but one who learned to listen to pain. For anyone who has been cut off from an innocent bond understands what it feels like to be stripped of normalcy. From there, King did not seek only rights. He sought healing for a society that had learned to fear closeness. In the sleep of history, there are memories that need not be loud to become engines of change. The memory of a closed door may be small, yet it is enough to keep a question awake whenever the world tries to lull us into resignation. For King, why was not a cry of rage. It was a steady, gentle knock on the door of a false order, a knock reminding us that what exists is not necessarily what is right. And once that question is present, it seeks larger answers. It leads King toward philosophy, theology, toward Gandhi, and the idea that injustice can be resisted without creating more suffering. But before he encountered those pages, before he became a voice for an entire people, he was only a child who had learned that some prohibitions do not arise from truth, but from fear. Elsewhere, far from Atlanta, another child was learning that same lesson of fear in a different form. Not through a closed door, but through living with two names, like two coats worn one atop the other. And that quiet inner tension would become the seed of a larger strategy: to enter the system in order to understand it, and then to use its own language to dismantle it from within. That is the rhythm of the following passage, as the story moves deeper into the struggle of identity. Two names and one human being trying not to be split in two. There are wounds that do not bleed. They leave no scars on the skin, yet they carve a fine fracture in the way a person calls themselves. For Nelson Mandela, that fracture began with something seemingly harmless: a new name assigned in the classroom. Rolihlahla, the name carrying the cadence of the land, the community, and the gatherings where a leader listens before speaking, was suddenly made to share space with Nelson, a tidy, convenient name, easy to record, easy to pronounce within a system unwilling to spend time understanding the indigenous. Renaming, under the light of colonial power, was never merely an administrative act. It was a message that another order was being laid over the old one, that to survive within this order, one had to become manageable. And when a person is made manageable, the first thing simplified is identity. Identity is complex. It demands listening. A label, by contrast, asks for nothing at all. It is simply applied and classified. Rolihlahla was a living memory. It carried family history, the rhythm of the village, and a sense of belonging. Nelson was a symbol. It belonged to the classroom, to discipline, to advancement within prescribed limits, and to a quiet invitation. Enter our world on our terms. The two names did not collide noisily. They flowed side by side like two currents through the same body, sometimes converging, sometimes pulling in opposite directions. In psychology, identity is not only the answer to the question, who am I, but also to where do I belong. When a name is replaced, the sense of belonging is touched. Mandela grew up between two spaces. On one side, the Thembu tradition, where voices are respected and power is bound to the responsibility of listening. On the other, the colonial world, where order is maintained through hierarchy, ledgers, and norms that require people to adjust themselves to fit the mold. Inner tension does not always announce itself as a crisis. Sometimes it is merely a feeling of slight misalignment, like wearing a jacket that does not quite fit, not immediately painful, but constantly reminding you that you are adapting. Mandela learned to live with this sensation early. He learned to respond when called Nelson, while keeping a quiet space in his heart, reserved for Rolihlahla. That space was not open rebellion. It was an act of preservation, holding on to a part of himself so it would not be entirely swallowed. Every system of power prefers simplicity. It wants people defined by a single label: slave, second-class citizen, native, subject. But human beings are not simple. A proper name does more than summon. It carries echoes of memory, of connection, of lullabies, of moments of recognition. And so, when the colonial system assigned the name Nelson, it was not merely changing a syllable. It was testing a hypothesis. If I can call you by my name, can I make you live by my logic? Mandela gradually understood that this question was not addressed to him alone. It was posed to an entire people, being severed from language, history, and the ability to tell their own story. And when a people lose the right to narrate themselves, they slowly lose the capacity to imagine. This is the deepest layer of the invisible cage. It not only confines people to the present, but it also makes the future difficult to envision. Yet living with two names also forged another capacity, rare and vital: the ability to see the system from both sides. Mandela understood the language of his homeland, and he learned the language of power. He understood the rhythm of community, and he understood the rhythm of paperwork. He understood the warmth of the listening circle, and he understood the coldness of procedure. This double awareness, if it brings only pain, can break a person apart. But if disciplined, it can become a strategic instrument. In many struggles, some choose to stand outside the system in protest. That stance has the strength of purity. But Mandela learned another lesson early on. Sometimes, to dismantle a machine, you must know how it works. You must read the symbols etched into its frame, understand where the locks are, where the gears turn. The tension between Rolihlahla and Nelson taught him that entering the system is not necessarily surrender. At times, it is the only way to see its structure clearly. The colonial world inadvertently trained Mandela in emotional control. For when you live with two names, you learn when to reveal and when to withhold. You learn to speak in a language others understand without losing your inner voice. You learn to exist within a space that is not yours without letting it claim you entirely. These lessons may seem small, but they form a very particular kind of strength, the strength of self-mastery. Within that self-mastery, Mandela began to envision a path. It was neither an easy escape nor an act of revenge. It was a movement toward the center, studying law, understanding procedure, and using the system's own tools to expose its absurdity. When an architecture of power rests on false reasoning, what makes it tremble is not shouting, but a stronger reasoning spoken in the right place. If, for Frederick Douglass, the first seed of dignity came from a mother walking through the night, and for Martin Luther King Jr., the seed of awakening came from a forbidden friendship, then for Mandela, that seed arose from living with a quiet, persistent question: who am I when the world insists on naming me on its terms? The question was not answered immediately, but it trained him in an essential habit, refusing ready-made definitions and refusing to let the system write the story of his life. As night falls, the two names remain. Rolihlahla, like the wind of home. Nelson, like the scratch of a pen on paper. They do not merge, nor do they erase each other. Together, they create an inner depth. And from that depth, one realization becomes clear. Awareness cannot stop at feeling. If the world is to be changed, awareness must be forged into a tool. And that is where we move next, when these seeds cease to be merely memories and become weapons. Douglass's knowledge, Mandela's law, and the philosophy of nonviolence that King will discover in the pages of books. In a world built on whips and silence, there was something more frightening than a strong slave. It was a slave who could read. Physical strength can be subdued with a rope, but awakened consciousness, once stirred, is challenging to confine with any lock. Frederick Douglass entered this dangerous territory almost by accident, as if history sometimes opens a door through a narrow crack that power fails to seal in time. When he was still very young, Douglass was taught the first letters by his enslaver's wife, a woman not yet fully hardened by the system. At first, it appeared to be an ordinary gesture, even a kind one, a child, a book, a few written marks. But that very moment touched the deepest nerve of the slave system. The husband saw what the wife had not yet understood. Literacy was not a pastime, it was a doorway. And under slavery, every doorway had to be locked. He intervened with an anger bordering on fear, and spoke a sentence that was both a warning and a naked confession of how the system truly functioned. If he learns to read, he will never be content to be a slave again. To Douglass, this was more than a prohibition. It was like a beam of light, striking straight through the darkness, revealing the structure of the invisible cage. It said this: what keeps people confined is not only chains, but ignorance. It said this: knowledge is what power fears, because knowledge exposes the fact that chains are not natural. From that moment on, letters were no longer symbols. They became a promise. Douglass understood that if the oppressor considered reading dangerous, then within reading lay a force of liberation. And like many pivotal journeys in history, this liberation began with small, nearly secret steps. Listening, remembering, gathering fragments of language from daily life, the way one gathers scattered grains. Douglass learned in moments when no one was watching. He befriended other children to trade for lessons. He studied letters on signs in newspapers, on scraps of paper carelessly discarded. Each word learned was like a small nail tapped into the invisible wall, not enough to break it, but enough to produce a sound. And once a sound is heard, the system's silence is no longer complete. But knowledge does not bring only light. It brings pain. This was the paradox Douglass soon faced. The more you know, the more you suffer. When you read about freedom, you feel more sharply your own lack of it. When you read about human dignity, you see more clearly how dignity is stripped away. Knowledge transforms injustice from a vague sensation into something that can be named, analyzed, and measured by reason. And in doing so, it turns the cage from a habit into a prison. There were moments when Douglas wished he had never learned to read, for ignorance can resemble a shallow sleep. It does not heal, but it numbs. Knowledge awakens. And once awakened, it is difficult to return to that numbness. This is the curse of knowledge. It makes a slave incapable of living peacefully within an imposed role. It turns existence itself into a continuous question. Why am I here? Who placed me here? And how might I step beyond it? Yet within that very curse lies the key. For when knowledge causes pain, it also brings clarity. It gives you language to understand that your suffering is not the result of your inadequacy, but of a structure deliberately designed that way. It separates you from guilt and leads you toward recognition. Injustice is not destiny. It is a system that can be dismantled. And when an oppressed person grasps this truth, they cease to be merely an object of endurance. They begin to become a thinking subject. Knowledge also taught Douglas something essential about power. Power is not only violence, it is the ability to control the story. If you cannot read, you cannot read the law. If you cannot read the law, you cannot see how the law is written to legitimize oppression. If you cannot read history, you will believe that your condition has always been this way. Learning to read for Douglas was therefore not just acquiring a skill. It was an act of reclaiming access to the world of meaning. It was the first step toward reclaiming the right to understand. When a person begins to understand, they begin to see connections that were once concealed. Douglas saw the subtle collusion between distorted religion and economic power. He saw how the language of order was used to mask violence. He saw that the system persisted not only because of a few cruel individuals, but because of an entire network of interests and silences. Knowledge did not give him peace. It gave him lucidity. And that lucidity, painful though it was the only thing capable of leading toward freedom. What distinguished Douglas was that he did not learn solely to free himself, but to free the story. He understood that the enslaved were deprived not only of the right to live, but of the right to narrate. If you cannot tell your own story, someone else will tell it for you, and they will tell it in ways that serve them. Knowledge gave Douglas the power to do the opposite, to reclaim the authority to define reality. When a slave can read, write, and reason, he becomes what the system fears most, a witness armed with argument. From here, we begin to see a weapon taking shape. It is not a blade, not a gun. It is the ability to turn experience into argument, pain into language, silence into testimony. Douglas would carry this weapon into the world, forcing those who had treated slavery as a distant abstraction to confront its truth within their own conscience. But knowledge was not the only weapon being forged. Elsewhere, Nelson Mandela was also stepping onto a different path to confront power. He turned toward the law, with the belief that if injustice could be written into statutes, then those statutes could also be challenged by reason. And as we move into the next part, the story will shift from the letters learned by a slave to the clauses of a system where law can be both shield and hammer. When a society seeks to make injustice endure, it does not rely on violence alone. It requires text. Clauses written in black ink on white paper possess the power to transform oppression into order, coercion into procedure, and pain into something officially permitted. Nelson Mandela entered the world of law with a hopeful yet straightforward belief. If human beings are bound by law, then human beings can also be freed by statute. At first, the law appeared to him as a shield, a legitimate instrument for defending dignity within a system that seemed immovable. Mandela studied law not because he believed it to be neutral, but because he thought it could be compelled to confront its own contradictions. In lecture halls and law offices, he perceived a possibility to use the language of power to question power itself. If the system spoke in clauses, he would respond in clauses. If it justified itself through procedure, he would counter with reason. At this stage, the law still retained the appearance of a protective tool, a thin but necessary armor for those without material power. But the deeper Mandela went, the clearer it became that the law was not only a shield. In the hands of a state built on racial segregation, it was also a hammer. Laws drafted in seemingly objective language were wielded to strike down human lives with systematic force. The law dictated who could live where, who could learn what, who was allowed to move freely, and who had to request permission simply to exist. The cruelty of this hammer lay in the fact that it did not require anger. It only needed the correct procedure. Mandela witnessed courtrooms where justice was performed as ritual, while the outcome had already been decided. He saw people condemned, not because they were wrong, but because they existed in the wrong place within a predetermined order. The law, meant to protect individuals from the arbitrariness of power, had become the very mechanism that legitimized that arbitrariness. This was the first moment of disillusionment, realizing that the tool he trusted could be bent so far that it turned against its original purpose. For a mind grounded in reason, disillusionment did not lead immediately to abandonment. It led to an analysis. Mandela began to see law as a structure of power in its own right, not merely a collection of rules. He recognized that law reflects the values of those who write it. When political power is founded on discrimination, the law will carry the imprint of discrimination even when presented in neutral language. And under such conditions, obeying the law does not necessarily mean serving justice. This understanding confronted Mandela with a difficult moral question. If the law itself is unjust, is one's duty to obey it or to challenge it? The question offered no comfortable answer. To challenge the law meant stepping outside the safety of what is legal, but to obey it meant becoming a cog in a machine that crushed dignity. Mandela realized that one cannot rely solely on a shield in a battle where the opponent wields a hammer. There are moments when holding the shield is simply not enough to stop the blow. Yet he did not discard the law. Instead, he altered his perspective. Law was no longer a final refuge. It became a battlefield. On that battlefield, every clause, every trial, every argument was an opportunity to expose the system's absurdity. When a statute becomes so unjust that it can no longer justify itself, it begins to reveal the fragility of the power behind it. Mandela learned to use the very rigor of the law to demonstrate that beneath the cloak of procedure, no justice was being protected. Through this process, Mandela also learned the value of discipline and patience. The law does not change quickly. It demands time, documentation, and the endurance of repeated failure. Yet it was precisely this slowness that forged in him a quality essential for long struggles: the ability not to react to immediate emotion. He understood that power favors impulsive responses because they are easy to label and suppress. A steady argument, repeated calmly over time, though slow, has the capacity to wear down the surface of a system. The law also taught Mandela about the limits of reform from within. When every legal door leads to the same wall, continuing to knock ceases to be a strategy. It was then that he recognized that some systems cannot be repaired by obeying their rules. This realization was not a rejection of ethics, but a confrontation with reality. An order without shame will not change voluntarily, simply because it is addressed with reasonable appeals. At this point, the law revealed its dual nature fully, both a shield that protects small spaces of dignity and a hammer capable of shattering lives when placed in the wrong hands. Mandela was not naive about these two faces. He learned to carry the shield, but also to evade and expose the hammer. He understood that transforming a system requires more than legal correctness. It requires moral pressure strong enough to force the system to examine itself. This maturation of understanding prepared Mandela for more difficult choices ahead. When law proved insufficient, the question of method became urgent. How does one apply pressure without abandoning moral purpose? How does one resist state violence without reproducing violence within the movement itself? These questions could not be answered by clauses or precedents alone. They demanded another compass, a philosophy capable of keeping human beings upright, even when pushed to the limit. And it is here that our story turns onto another path. In a quiet library, Martin Luther King Jr. was finding a philosophical answer to the childhood question he had carried for so long. He encountered a teacher through the pages of a book, a man who had demonstrated that it was possible to challenge power without creating additional suffering. The next part will take us to that encounter, where the philosophy of nonviolence becomes the guiding principle for a struggle of profound moral depth. There are encounters that require no handshake, no crowded room, no stage lights, no formal introductions. They take place in silence between the soft turning of pages, and sometimes leave the reader with a feeling difficult to name, as if one has finally found the correct key for a lock carried since childhood. For Martin Luther King Jr., such an encounter occurred in a library, a quiet space where history does not shout, but whispers. There, he met Mohandas Gandhi, not through sight but through thought. King carried within him an early wound, the door of friendship that had been closed, a simple sentence, sharp as a blade, and the question, why, that returned whenever he saw a dividing sign, a forbidden seat, an averted glance on the street. That question was not merely the curiosity of childhood. It was a sustained moral unease. How could a society live calmly with injustice and still call itself civilized? And more importantly, how could one change it without becoming a replica of the very thing one opposes? Through years of study and reflection, King understood well the seduction of rage. Rage can make us feel alive, righteous, and powerful. But rage can also burn away what we seek to protect: compassion, the capacity to listen, and the goal of building a shared society. In places where injustice has taken root, violence is not merely an act. It is a language that has been systematized. To confront it in the same language may win a battle, but it risks losing the soul. Gandhi emerged as a different possibility, a way of not fighting that could still prevail. As King read about Gandhi's campaigns of non-cooperation and resistance, he felt as though he were seeing a new map for a land long thought to have no path. Gandhi did not ask people to be weak. On the contrary, he demanded a courage more difficult than violence, the courage to endure without retaliation, the courage to face humiliation without humiliating others, the courage to turn one's own body into a site where the absurdity of power is laid bare. Nonviolence, in common misunderstanding, is often mistaken for passivity. But Gandhi, and then King, shaped it into a weapon with structure. Not silence, but voice. Not stillness, but disciplined action. It resembled a peculiar kind of blade. It cuts without causing wounds, yet it makes the system bleed. Bleed legitimacy, bleed moral authority, bleed faith in the naturalness of injustice. What drew King most was not only strategic effectiveness, but psychological depth. Nonviolence does not begin in the streets. It starts within. It requires those who struggle to confront their own anger, to learn not to let that anger steer their lives, and to transform its energy into discipline. In the world of Jim Crow, where humiliation was arranged daily like a test, nonviolence was a refusal to turn humiliation into hatred. It was a way of preventing the system from deforming the human being from the inside out. King carried this philosophy back and placed it alongside another source that had shaped him since childhood, the Christianity of love. For him, nonviolence was not merely a tactic, it was an ethic. Not love as a soft sentiment, but a resolve to see one's enemy as human, not to excuse injustice, but to refuse to let injustice turn oneself into a brutal being. King understood that the ultimate goal was not simply to change laws, but to transform the heart of society. And a society cannot be healed by tearing it further apart. This philosophy gave King an answer to his childhood question: why could be transformed into how. How does one apply pressure that cannot be ignored while preserving dignity for both the oppressed and those who hold power? How does one force a system to look at itself as a mirror reflecting its own absurdity? Nonviolence in King's hands became a method of turning endurance into political language. When the powerless collectively refuse to cooperate with injustice, the system is confronted with a stark truth. It survives through the obedience of those it oppresses. Here we begin to see the three weapons of these three figures interlock, like components of a larger mechanism. Douglas opened the door of knowledge to escape anonymity. Mandela entered the law to expose the legalized hammer, and King found a compass to transform the pain of separation into organized moral pressure. Three different paths converging toward a single aim, reclaiming the right to define humanity from the grasp of power's architectures. And within nonviolence itself, there is something deeply aligned with the rhythm of deep sleep. It is slow. It promises no instant results. It demands time, repetition, and faith that small movements, kept in the correct rhythm, can loosen an entire wall. This is how history sometimes changes, not through an explosion, but through a steady sequence of heartbeats. Yet any map remains only a map until someone sets foot on the road. Douglas's knowledge, Mandela's law, King's philosophy, all were still tools forged in the mind and on the page. To truly change the world, they would have to go where power was no longer an abstraction, but a specific hand, a specific face, a specific moment that forced a choice. Bow down or stand upright. And that is where the story moves next, as the first confrontations begin, not in thought, but in bodies, in voices, and in moments when fear is pushed to its limit. There are confrontations that are never planned. They do not arise from ideals or strategy, but from something more profound than thought, the survival reflex of dignity when it is pushed to its absolute limit. For Frederick Douglass, that moment arrived on an ordinary morning, on land where power was exercised not through words, but through habits of domination repeated long enough to become invisible. Edward Covey was known as a slave breaker. He did not need to wield the whip at all times. His accurate instruments were constant surveillance, unpredictable punishments, and an atmosphere of tension that caused people to shrink inward even before an order was given. Covey understood the psychology of submission, not to beat a person until exhaustion, but to keep fear permanently present, hovering, so that the body would learn obedience on its own. Under his hand, Douglas was worn down day by day, not only in strength, but in his sense of ownership over his own body. The body, under slavery, does not belong to the one who lives within it. It is an asset expected to function at full capacity. When the body slows, tires, or resists, the system intervenes to correct it. But there is a limit, a boundary which, once crossed, the body no longer endures. That morning, when Covey attempted to bind and punish him, what followed was not a calculated moral decision, but an instinctive movement. Douglas resisted. The struggle was rough, brief, and unheroic. Two bodies tangled in dirt and mud, breath ragged, strength draining away. There was no audience, no rallying cry, only one truth being tested: whether fear would continue to hold the center. Douglas did not win in the conventional sense, but something more decisive occurred. Covey retreated, and that retreat, even a single step, altered the psychological order. In that moment, Douglas grasped a simple realization with explosive force. The oppressor is not omnipotent. Fear, the force that had inhabited his body, did not vanish entirely, but it was no longer the absolute master. That realization was like switching on a light in a dark room. Everything remained, but its shape changed. After the struggle, Covey never punished Douglas again. Legally, he was still enslaved. Internally, a chain had fallen away. This is the pivotal truth of the story. Freedom does not begin with paperwork. It starts with the body. Before a person can think of escape, of writing, or of persuading others, they must reclaim the sense that their body belongs to them. The struggle with Covey did not grant Douglas immediate freedom, but it gave him something equally vital: inner autonomy. From that moment on, he knew that submission was not fate, but a condition that could be broken. The psychology of this moment is subtle. Violence in the hands of the system is a familiar language, but Douglas's resistance was not a declaration of violence meant to replace violence. It was a bounded act, occurring at the precise point where the body was violated beyond any remaining choice. That limit is what made the difference. This was not retaliation, but the reclamation of a boundary. And once a boundary is established, power must recalibrate. The struggle also marked the transition from awareness to action. Before this, Douglas had learned letters, understood the structure of injustice, and felt dignity through the memory of his mother. Yet all of it remained in the mind. When the body rose, knowledge and memory found physical grounding. Awareness no longer floated. It anchored itself in muscle, breath, and pain that was real. From here on, Douglas's path was no longer one of intelligent endurance alone, but of deliberate movement toward escape. There is a paradox that must be stated carefully. This moment of personal violence does not contradict the long moral arc of Douglas's life. It did not open a path of armed struggle. It opened a path of truth-telling. Once a person knows they do not have to bow, they can stand before the public without trembling. Uprightness of the body prepares uprightness of speech. And that is why, later, when Douglas stood at the lectern, his voice carried a rare solidity, the solidity of someone who had reclaimed his body from fear. The struggle with covey also reveals something fundamental about power. Power depends on habit. When a habit is broken, even once, power must adjust. Covey retreated, not because he became better, but because he recognized that the psychological cost of continued punishment had increased. In the cold logic of the system, this was a failure, and each small failure like this, multiplied across time and people, creates cracks in the wall. If earlier parts showed awareness being planted and tools being forged, here we see the first step taken onto the territory of fear, not to conquer it, but to pass through it. From this moment, Douglas carried another memory, the memory that fear can be faced without destroying the self. That memory would follow him when he escaped, when he wrote, when he spoke, and when he compelled an entire society to listen. Elsewhere, in other spaces, first confrontations were also taking shape in very different forms. For Martin Luther King Jr., confrontation would come through language, not fists, but argument, not mud and soil, but silence, broken by calm speech. Douglas's confrontation reclaimed the body. King's confrontation would reclaim public space. And that is where the story moves next, as the power of reason first begins to shake the room. There are confrontations that require no physical collision. They unfold in the air, through exchanged glances, through silences that last longer than expected. For Martin Luther King Jr., his first confrontation did not come from the streets or the prison cell, but from a room where people believed that everything could be decided by words. There he learned a fundamental lesson. When power grows accustomed to going unchallenged, a calm argument can unsettle an entire room. King grew up in a world of unanswered questions. The childhood why, born the day friendship was forbidden, did not fade with time. It matured alongside him, searching for a form in which it could finally be spoken. During his years of study, King came to understand that anger can make a voice louder, but it does not make an argument stronger. If the goal is to change how a society thinks, what matters is not volume, but coherence. The first time King stood before an audience to debate, no one expected a historic moment. It was merely a student oratory contest, a safe space where ideas were allowed to collide without serious consequence. Yet it was precisely this safety that revealed a more profound truth. People were accustomed to polished rhetoric, but rarely to arguments that addressed the structure of injustice head-on. When King began, his voice was not yet deep, his rhythm not yet refined. But there was something unusual. He spoke slowly, clearly, and without evasion. He did not tell stories to solicit pity. He did not use language to attack individuals. He laid out a chain of reasoning, step by step, like placing stones across a stream. Racial segregation, he argued, was not merely the prejudice of a few individuals. It was a system fundamentally at odds with the very values society claimed to uphold. When a nation speaks of freedom while classifying its citizens by skin color, the argument collapses under its own weight. No anger is required to expose this, only consistency. The room fell silent. Not the silence of indifference, but the silence of being compelled to think. It was in that moment that King felt the strange power of argument. It does not need to persuade everyone immediately. It only needs to make them stop. Stop to listen, stop to consider, stop to recognize that what they had assumed to be self-evident might not be stable after all. In the psychology of persuasion, there is a crucial principle. People rarely change when they are attacked. but they are more likely to change when they discover their own contradictions. King had intuitively touched this principle. He did not say, "You are wrong." He said, "This reasoning does not fit." And when an argument no longer fits, it begins to collapse from within. That was King's strength. He allowed truth to do its own work. After the speech, the applause was brief, but the effect lingered. King realized that words, when placed correctly, could open a new space, a space in which listeners were no longer passive spectators, but participants in a process of thinking. He understood that a first voice does not need to be perfect. It needs to be honest and structured. And structure, like a bridge, allows others to cross over fear and approach truth. From that point on, King began to train his voice as an instrument, not to make it louder, but to make it more precise. He learned how to arrange ideas, how to control rhythm, and how to use silence as punctuation. He knew that a strong argument is not only about content, but also about breath. When the speaker breathes slowly, the listener slows as well. And when the rhythm slows, defensiveness diminishes. This was the art of a voice that does not seek to win, but to open. The power of argument also taught King a lesson about responsibility. The ability to persuade carries with it the ability to harm if used carelessly. For this reason, he bound the argument to ethics. He refused to speak what was tactically effective but morally false. The philosophy of nonviolence he encountered in Gandhi became the compass that kept his voice from slipping into manipulation. Argument in King's hands was not meant to defeat an opponent. It was meant to make truth impossible to ignore. Here, a subtle intersection emerges between the experiences of Douglas and King. Douglas reclaimed his body through a bound struggle that shattered the habit of fear. King reclaimed mental space through an argument that broke the habit of silence. One proved that the body does not have to bow. The other proved that the voice does not have to whisper. Both revealed the same truth. Power relies on habit. When habit is interrupted, power must adapt. King's first voice did not immediately change the law, but it changed how he saw the road ahead. He understood that to go far, a voice must be placed within a community, not as individual talent, but as collective discipline. Argument must be repeated, shared, and sustained by people willing to stand together in organized silence. From this moment on, the voice ceased to be an event. It became a method. And once the method took shape, the next question arose. What happens when argument meets a system that has lost its capacity for shame? When calm words are no longer heard? When does state violence respond with legalized force? This is the boundary where nonviolence faces its most significant test, the limit of patience. Elsewhere, Nelson Mandela was approaching that same boundary, as law proved insufficient to shield against the hammer of power. And there, the story moves into its following passage, where we look directly at the most challenging moment of ethics, when patience runs thin and choices no longer remain pure. Patience is often praised as a virtue, but within systems designed not to listen, patience can also become a trap. It prolongs suffering, erodes the spirit, and sometimes allows endurance to be mistaken for acceptance. For Nelson Mandela and his movement, nonviolence was not an easy moral posture, but a demanding discipline, one that required time, self-control, and faith that the opponent still possessed the capacity for shame. In the early years, nonviolence was chosen as an affirmation of dignity. Marches, strikes, and petitions, these actions were not meant to provoke violence. but to compel the system to see the people it was trying to render invisible. Each peaceful step was a reminder. We exist, we understand our rights, and we refuse to become an excuse for repression. At this stage, nonviolence was both a strategy and a mirror, reflecting the absurdity of power back at itself. But time passed, and the mirrors were repeatedly shattered. Each demonstration ended in silence or state violence. Each moral appeal was met with cold procedure. Each hope that righteousness alone would persuade power was gradually worn down. Here, a psychological paradox emerged. When a system no longer feels shame, nonviolence risks being interpreted as weakness. And once interpreted that way, it ceases to apply pressure. It creates the conditions for repression to continue. Mandela arrived at this realization not through impulsiveness, but through careful observation. He listened to every report, witnessed every injury, and counted every closed door to dialogue. He understood that nonviolence is effective only when the opponent still cares about moral judgment. When that concern disappears, appeals to conscience become hollow. The problem lay not in the value of nonviolence, but in the ethical context required for it to function. This is the most challenging moment for a leader, acknowledging that a principled approach may be insufficient in a particular circumstance. Such acknowledgement is not a rejection of ethics. It is honesty in the face of reality. Mandela understood that patience, when stretched without limit, can dissolve the very movement it seeks to protect. Waiting too long turns discipline into exhaustion, sacrifice into bitterness, and opens the door to unstructured reactions. The same outcome that power waits for in order to legitimize repression. At a deeper level, this is a story about the limits of the human body and spirit. No one can endure indefinitely without change. When suffering goes unrecognized, it accumulates as pressure, and pressure, without a structured release, seeks chaotic escape. Mandela confronted this choice not as a theory, but as a matter of survival for those who had placed their trust in him. The decision to acknowledge the limits of nonviolence was therefore not a betrayal of philosophy, but a strategic adjustment to preserve long-term moral goals. It was like admitting that a road had been blocked, not because it was wrong, but because it no longer led to the destination under present conditions. Mandela did not glorify violence. He was wary of it. But neither did he romanticize endless suffering. He understood that a shameless system will not change simply because it is politely asked. What mattered was how he crossed that boundary. Instead of loosening discipline, he reinforced it. Instead of encouraging revenge, he emphasized restraint, purpose, and responsibility. The exhaustion of patience did not open the door to chaos. It compelled the movement to mature in its use of pressure. This was the point where ethics and strategy were forced into rigorous dialogue, so that the soul would not be lost in the pursuit of change. At the psychological depth of this moment lies a hard lesson. Sometimes holding fast to values does not mean holding fast to methods. Nonviolence remained the compass, but the path had to be redrawn. When a technique no longer works, clinging to it can turn virtue into empty ritual. Mandela chose to keep the compass, dignity, responsibility, and the goal of reconciliation, while seeking another route forward. This shift did not erase what nonviolence had achieved. On the contrary, it placed those achievements within reality, where pressure needed to be intensified in order to force power into negotiation. It was precisely the recognition of limits that created the conditions for a new phase of struggle. one in which public speech, testimony, and argument would resonate more forcefully, making it impossible for society to look away. Here, Mandela's story also reflects the journeys of the others. Douglas reclaimed the body in order to speak. King refined his argument in order to persuade. Mandela, at this threshold, understood that for words not to sink into silence, pressure had to be strong enough to open the door to dialogue, not to destroy, but to compel listening. And as that door began to open, the role of voice became decisive. Personal stories would be brought into the light, not as isolated complaints, but as systemic evidence. Testimony would no longer merely recount suffering. It would reshape the national conversation. From the boundary of patience, history prepared to enter another phase, one in which the power of public speech would render silence unacceptable. That is where we go next, as words move beyond meeting rooms and churches to step onto the public stage, where truth, once spoken clearly and often enough, begins to reclaim the authority to define reality. There are escapes that do not end when the feet stop running. They truly begin only when a person is forced to confront a deeper question: what will be done with the freedom just gained? For Frederick Douglass, escaping slavery was not the closing chapter of a heroic tale, but the beginning of a heavy responsibility. The responsibility to speak what millions could not, and to tell it in a way that made the world unable to pretend it had not heard. Douglass's flight unfolded in silence, tension, and constant risk. There were no cheers, no triumphal moments. Freedom, in its first instant, appeared as fragile as a thin sheet of paper. A single mistake, a suspicious glance, one question asked in the wrong place could have dragged him back into the old cage. And yet, once the boundary was crossed, what remained was not pure relief, but a strange emptiness. When the chains fall away, one must learn to stand under one's own weight. In the early days of freedom, Douglass did not rush to speak. He observed. He listened. He understood that freedom does not automatically grant a voice with authority. That voice must be built through credibility, precision, and the ability to make others recognize that this was not an isolated, personal story. Many white audiences of the time expected something else from him: a suffering victim, a tale designed to soften hearts, a confirmation that they could feel compassion without changing the structure of society. Douglass refused that role. When he first stepped onto the lecture platform, what stunned listeners was not tears, but composure. He did not speak to beg for sympathy. He analyzed in order to demand accountability. Slavery, through his voice, did not appear as a series of isolated cruelties, but as a system with its own logic, economic interests, and widespread complicity. That calm clarity inverted expectations. Listeners could not comfortably weep and then walk away. They were compelled to think. Here, the psychology of power was struck at its weakest point. When pain is presented as personal tragedy, society can soothe itself with pity. But when pain is placed within a structure, society must face a more complex question: who benefits from this, and why is it allowed to continue? Douglass understood that boundary precisely. He turned experience into evidence, memory into argument, and the silence of the past into an accusation that needed no shouting. The voice of the fugitive thus carried a particular force. It did not speak from the outside, nor from a position of safety. It said from the boundary, from someone who had lived inside the system and stepped beyond it. That boundary gave Douglass a moral authority no academic credential could replace. When he spoke of the lash, it was not borrowed imagery. When he spoke of the stripping away of identity, it was not an abstract concept. Yet he did not allow personal experience to overwhelm argument. He maintained enough distance to see the larger picture. One of Douglas's most important strategies was his refusal to simplify. He would not allow himself to be framed as a living proof of the benevolence of the abolitionist cause. He asserted the right to complexity, to think, to argue, to criticize even his allies when necessary. In doing so, he shattered a dangerous assumption that the oppressed could only appear as victims or symbols, never as thinkers. Douglas's voice spread not only because of what it said, but because of how it repositioned the listener. He did not stand below, looking up. He stood level, demanding dialogue. This created a necessary discomfort. Dialogue, unlike pity, requires recognition of equality. And it was precisely this equality of tone that made many realize that slavery was not someone else's problem, but a question of conscience for the entire nation. At a deeper level, Douglas's voice accomplished something else. It reclaimed the right to narrate. For decades, the story of slavery had been written by those who did not live it, through reports, laws, and justifications. When Douglas spoke, that order was reversed. The one who had been defined became the one who defined. This reversal was quiet, but it shook the foundations of symbolic power, where language determines what is considered normal. There was a price attached to this voice. The more visible Douglas became, the more he was threatened. His freedom remained fragile in a society where the law could be bent. Yet instead of retreating, he chose to speak more clearly, more sharply. He understood that silence at this point would protect no one, least of all himself. In that resolve, he transformed personal freedom into political freedom, not merely a condition for living, but a mandate for action. When Douglas's voice began to resonate, it did not stand alone. It created a precedent. That personal experience, when placed within structure and expressed through reason, could change how a society understands itself. That precedent would be taken up by others in different ways, through lecture halls, churches, and public squares. Speech was no longer mere narration. It became force. And as that force grew, a new question emerged. If speech could reshape perception, could it also prevent history from being written falsely? Could the story of the oppressed be recorded in a way that resisted distortion? To answer that, Douglas would take one more step, less dramatic than public oratory, but no less decisive. He would write. From the voice of the fugitive, the story now turns to the power of the written word, where memory no longer depends on the moment, and where history begins to be reclaimed, page by page. There are struggles that do not unfold in the streets, nor resound in crowded halls. They take place in silence, between a writer and a blank page. Yet it is there that the order of power can be reversed most deeply and most enduringly. For Frederick Douglass, the decision to write his life was not merely the telling of a personal story. It was an act of reclaiming history from those who had long been accustomed to writing for others, defining for others, and speaking in their place. For decades, enslaved people appeared in texts as shadows. They were counted, described, classified, but rarely heard. They existed as objects of law, of economics, of moral hypocrisy, not as subjects of thought. Douglass understood with clarity that when a person is denied the right to tell their own story, society will tell it for them in the way most convenient to power. And that substituted story, however neutral it may appear, always serves to preserve the existing order. Writing, therefore, was not an act of remembrance. It was an act of confrontation. When Douglas took up the pen, he did more than record memory. He selected, structured, and named experiences the system sought to keep anonymous. Each page was a quiet but resolute assertion. I do not merely exist within your history. I have a history of my own. And that history is not a marginal footnote, but the center of the question. There is a latent danger in writing about pain. It can be consumed as a form of moral entertainment, moving the reader without changing anything. Douglas avoided that trap through cold precision. He did not exaggerate, nor heighten emotion for shock. He described, analyzed, and allowed the structure of slavery to reveal itself through detail. The lash appears not as sensational imagery, but as a tool applied according to procedure. The stripping away of identity emerges not as an accident, but as a strategy. It was precisely this composure that made the autobiography dangerous to the old order. It did not allow readers to retreat into the safety of pity. It compelled them to recognize that the problem lay not with a few cruel individuals, but with an entire system sustained by society. When truth is presented through reason, it becomes harder to dismiss than when it is delivered through tears alone. Writing also granted Douglas a new form of power, control over time. Spoken words may sound and fade, be truncated or misunderstood, but writing remains. It can be reread, quoted, and carried far from its original setting. By writing, Douglas had the story of the enslaved beyond moment and place, transforming it into part of the collective memory. This was a crucial transition, from living witness to historical document. In the psychology of power, the ability to shape collective memory is among the most enduring forms of authority. Whoever tells the story of the past influences how society imagines the future. Douglas understood that if the memory of slavery were blurred, romanticized, or reduced, new forms of oppression would easily emerge under different names. Writing, for him, was a way of setting an anchor, a point that could not be erased without exposing deceit. There is a subtle paradox here. When Douglas wrote his life, he did not narrow the story to the self. He expanded it. He wrote with enough specificity for the story to be true, and enough clarity for it to be representative. His life became a lens through which readers could see millions of other lives kept from view. This is the most challenging art of political autobiography, ensuring that the personal does not consume the collective, and that the collective does not dilute the personal. Writing was also an act of reclaiming intellectual dignity. In a society that had used illiteracy to justify enslavement, the fact that a former slave produced a coherent, incisive work was a direct refutation. It shattered the assumption that intellect is tied to skin color or social position, and when that assumption collapsed, a crucial pillar of the architecture of power collapsed with it. Yet reclaiming history did not occur in safety. Every page was also an exposure, exposing not only the system, but the writer himself. Douglas placed himself in the sights of those with a vested interest in maintaining silence. Writing in this case was not an escape from danger, but an entry into it by other means. Instead of running, he stood and recorded. Perhaps the most profound aspect of Douglas's writing lies in the fact that it does not seek closure. He did not write to declare the story finished. He wrote to open unresolved questions. What is freedom without citizenship? What is equality if it is not protected by law and opportunity? In this way, the autobiography does not belong only to the past. It addresses the reader's present directly. When history is reclaimed through writing, it sets off a chain reaction. It encourages other voices to rise, different stories to be recorded, and other memories to be preserved. Writing becomes a collective act, even when it begins with one person. From there, the struggle enters a new phase, one in which voices are not only heard from lecterns, but etched into the foundations of social memory. But writing, powerful as it is, still needs to be fueled by community. It must be read, spoken aloud, woven into the inner lives of people. And it is at this point that another source of energy begins to ignite. The energy of faith, of sacred language, of sermons capable of turning communal space into a center of resistance. From the page of Douglass, the story now moves to another pulpit, where Martin Luther King Jr. transforms moral language into a collective flame, lighting hearts long weary from waiting. There are spaces that seem meant only for calm, places where people come to seek comfort, to lay their burdens down, and to listen for a promise of hope. Yet in specific historical moments, it is precisely these spaces that become the birthplace of moral power. For Martin Luther King Jr., the pulpit was not merely a place to speak of faith. It was where language was set alight, where a community learned how to stand upright without losing its gentleness. King understood well the psychology of those who entered the church each week. They carried fatigue, anxiety, and the fear of being crushed by an order that had become all too familiar. If the voice from the pulpit did nothing more than soothe, it would help people endure, but it would not allow them to change anything. King chose another path. He transformed the church into a center of awakening, where faith did not lull people to sleep, but stirred responsibility. What gave King his strength was not that he brought politics into the church, but that he brought ethics out of abstract texts and into lived reality. He spoke of justice as a promise yet unfulfilled, of love as a discipline that must be practiced, and of hope as a collective obligation. The language of Scripture, already familiar to the community, became a bridge, connecting the daily experience of segregation to universal values that no one dared publicly deny. When King spoke, he did not shout. He did not drive emotion to a peak, only to abandon the listener there. He kept a slow rhythm, allowing each sentence time to settle. That slowness had an apparent psychological effect. It lowered defensive reflexes, enabling people to absorb complex ideas without feeling attacked. In that atmosphere, speech ceased to be a command. It became an invitation to think together. The pulpit offered King another advantage: repetition. Each week, in the same space, before the same community, ideas were repeated, deepened, and anchored in concrete life. Social change rarely comes from a single speech. It comes through accumulation, when values are heard often enough to become a moral habit. King understood this, and he used the pulpit as the steady heartbeat of the movement. Here we see a subtle fusion of reason and emotion. King did not abandon argument. He placed it within familiar images: deserts and promised lands, darkness and light, the river of justice rolling on. These images were not merely beautiful, they helped listeners imagine a different future without requiring detailed blueprints. When people can imagine, they can endure the present without despair. The voice from the pulpit also accomplished something else of great importance. It transformed personal pain into shared responsibility. When King spoke of injustice, he did not say, "They have done this to us." He said, "This is a fracture in the soul of society." That shift changed the position of the listener. They were no longer merely victims. They became custodians of values that society itself was betraying. Responsibility, when shared, becomes lighter and stronger. The flame king ignited was not the fire of anger that flares and dies. It was the fire of commitment. Commitment not to answer hatred with hatred. Commitment not to let violence define who they were. Commitment to keep walking, even when the road was long and tempting shortcuts beckoned. That flame warmed weary hearts, yet burned bright enough to illuminate the difficult moral choices ahead. One element of the pulpit's power is often overlooked: preparation. King did not speak on impulse. He read, reflected, and weighed every word. He knew that a careless sentence could shatter the discipline of nonviolence he was building. Each sermon, therefore, was an act of responsibility, both inspiring and restraining the movement within the ethical boundaries it had set for itself. In the broader narrative, King's pulpit follows Douglas's page, if Douglas reclaimed history through writing. King carried that history into communal life through speech. One etched memory into books. The other set that memory ablaze in shared space. Both understood that lasting power lies not only in laws, but in how people understand themselves and one another. But when a flame burns brightly enough, it attracts the attention of power. And power, when challenged, rarely stands still. It seeks to extinguish the fire through surveillance, threats, legal maneuvers, and prisons. This is the harsh law of every struggle. When a voice grows too strong to ignore, the cost of resistance rises. King understood this, and precisely because he understood it, he emphasized inner discipline even more. The pulpit was not only a place to ignite the flame, it was a place to teach how to tend it when the winds grew strong. For if the flame turned into an uncontrolled blaze, it would consume even what it sought to protect. That self-mastery, keeping the fire hot without becoming destructive, was one of King's most subtle legacies in this period. When the congregation left the church, they carried with them not just emotion, but direction. That direction would lead them into the streets, into meeting rooms, and eventually into direct confrontation with the system's response. And there, the struggle entered another phase, the phase of cost. Prison, trials, exile, and personal loss began to appear as the unavoidable invoice for speaking the truth. From the flame on the pulpit, the story now moves into the darkness of repression, where each person must decide how much they are willing to pay for what they believe is right. There are rooms where history does not shout. It holds its breath, slows its pace, and lets each word fall like a heavy stone. The courtroom at Rivonia was such a place. There, state power cloaked itself in law, seeking to turn ideals into crimes. And there, a man stood not to beg for mercy, but to pose the most fundamental question of all. To whom does justice belong, and who has the right to define it? For Nelson Mandela, the trial was not the end of a political life, but a moment of choice. The choice to speak truth in a space designed to enforce silence. The setting at Rivonia allowed no romance. The charges were carefully assembled, the evidence presented in cold sequence. The state wanted a verdict, not a dialogue. Everything in that room was meant to narrow the story, narrow the motives, narrow the human being into a file. Yet within that narrowing, Mandela expanded the moral space by refusing the role imposed upon him. He did not stand as a defendant pleading for compassion. He stood as a witness to an era. When Mandela spoke, his voice did not seek to stir emotion through drama. It was calm, almost unsettlingly so. That calm was the product of years of inner discipline, a discipline that did not allow fear to steer speech. He did not deny his actions. He placed them in context. He did not evade responsibility. He shifted the focus from the individual to the system. This was a subtle reversal of rhetorical power. Instead of the court judging him, he transformed the court into a forum judging apartheid. The words, "I am prepared to die," were not a reckless provocation. They were an ultimate affirmation of legitimacy. When a system can survive only by forcing people to kneel, there comes a moment when someone chooses to stand, not because death is desired, but because life loses meaning if it must be lived in falsehood. Mandela understood the psychology of power intimately. It rests on the fear of loss. When that fear is neutralized, not through recklessness, but through lucid acceptance, power loses its most potent leverage. In his defense, Mandela did not call for hatred. He spoke of a society in which all people could live together in dignity. He articulated a goal not of overthrow for revenge, but of dismantling in order to coexist. It was this moral consistency that gave his words their weight. Any sentence, however severe, would have to carry a question of conscience along with it. The state could pronounce judgment, but it could not extinguish the question his words planted in the minds of those who heard them. The Rivonia trial revealed a truth often overlooked. The law may punish the body, but it struggles to bind meaning. When Mandela spoke, he was not only defending himself, he was defending the capacity to imagine a different future. He understood that even if convicted, his words would leave the room, carried through listeners, transcripts, and retold memories. State power controls the present. Words, when placed rightly, can shape how the present is remembered. The psychology of this moment was especially severe. Faced with the possibility of execution, most people seek the safest exit. Mandela chose the more challenging path, to hold to principle, not because he felt no fear, but because he understood the cost of compromise at a decisive moment. A plea for mercy might save a life, but it could also collapse the moral foundation of an entire movement. He chose to protect that foundation, allowing his own body to bear the consequence. Here, the three narrative threads converge. Douglas reclaimed the body in order to speak. King used speech to ignite a community. Mandela, at Rivonia, bound speech to a conscious willingness to pay the price, giving words their final gravity. When speech is joined to deliberate sacrifice, it crosses the boundary of argument and enters the realm of testimony, where one does not merely say what one believes, but lives with the consequences of that belief. The final sentence was not death, but life imprisonment. It was a political decision as much as a legal one. The state understood that killing a symbol might create another, even more potent symbol. Yet prison is cruel in its own way. It stretches time, erodes hope, and tests the ability to preserve identity through years of repetitive emptiness. As the courtroom doors closed, another door opened, the door to a long-term trial, where each day posed the same question: how does one prevent time itself from becoming the enemy? The Rivonia trial, therefore, did not conclude the story. It shifted its rhythm. The rhythm of waiting, of inner discipline, of keeping the flame alive in the absence of light. Mandela entered prison not as a defeated man, but as the bearer of an unfinished promise. That promise was not for him. It was for a nation still searching for the language to name justice, and it was within the enclosed space of prison, where time is used as punishment, that another struggle began. No pulpit, no courtroom remained. Only long days and small choices repeated again and again. There the question was no longer what to say to the world, but how to keep oneself from being broken. From Rivonia, history moved onward into the darkness of captivity, where the trial of time would determine whether words could survive when the speaker was stripped of the light. Prison does not merely lock doors, it locks the rhythm. It bends time into regular loops, where each day resembles the last so closely that a person begins to wonder whether they are still moving forward or simply standing still inside a clock with no hands. For Nelson Mandela, a prison sentence was not a dramatic moment, but an extended trial, a test of whether a human being could preserve identity when everything around them was designed to wear it down. The years on Robben Island began with calculated harshness. The glare from limestone blinded the eyes. Salt winds cut into the skin. Hard labor was repeated like a wordless lesson. You are only a body, and this body belongs to us. In the logic of prison, deprivation does not need to shout. It only needs to be consistent. When everything happens on schedule, according to procedure, pain becomes routine, and routine is the most dangerous thing of all, because it causes people to forget that they have the right to object. Mandela understood early on that if he allowed time to dominate him, he would lose. Prison does not only punish the present, it attempts to seize the future by stretching the present indefinitely. The only way to resist was to redefine time itself. Rather than seeing each day as a sentence, he divided it into small units of discipline. Hours for reading, hours for reflection, hours for labor, hours of deliberate silence. Once time was structured, it was no longer a formless enemy. It became a sequence of tasks that could be endured. In confinement, state power tries to reduce a person to the bare minimum. A prisoner number, a schedule, a set of rules. Mandela responded by expanding inward. He learned the language of the guards, not to flatter them, but to understand. To understand in order to anticipate, to understand in order not to be caught off guard, to understand in order to retain autonomy within the smallest spaces. This is a profound psychological lesson. Understanding is not agreement. It is a way of refusing to be controlled. Prison is also where relationships are tested. Isolation not only separates people from society, it strips them of familiar roles: father, husband, friend. Letters arrive slowly, visits are brief, and news from the outside world is fragmented. Mandela knew that the deepest pain did not lie in limestone or salt wind, but in emotional absence. That absence, if neglected, turns into bitterness. And bitterness, if cultivated, becomes hatred, something he was determined not to allow. One of the most challenging choices in prison is to keep the heart open. Closing it would dull the pain, but it would also mean surrendering the capacity for empathy, the foundation of the reconciled future he still believed necessary. Mandela chose the more challenging path, allowing himself to feel loss without letting loss define him. This was not passive endurance. It was an active discipline of the spirit, requiring daily reminders that the larger purpose outweighed personal suffering. Within locked spaces, education became a form of resistance. Whispered discussions, shared books, improvised lessons during breaks. Prison inadvertently became a school, not because conditions were good, but because there was a need to prevent the intellect from freezing. Mandela encouraged learning not as an escape from reality, but as preparation for another reality. When people know, they place a marker in the future, a marker that says this time is not all there is. The trial of time was also a trial of steadiness. Years passed with no clear signals from outside. Hope, if unmanaged, can become a double-edged sword. Mandela learned to hold hope at the right level, enough to avoid despair, but not so much that it shattered with disappointment. He did not promise himself or others a release date. Instead, he vowed to preserve dignity each day. When the goal is brought into the present, each day lived with integrity becomes a small victory. Prison often shrinks a person's dreams. Mandela resisted this by keeping his dream at the level of principle, not timetable. The principle was clear: a society in which people could live together without being classified by race. A dream held as a principle carries a crucial psychological advantage. It does not depend on release dates or political shifts. It exists as a direction, not as an appointment. There were moments when prison tested self-control in subtle ways. Small privileges were offered in exchange for silence. Personal opportunities might arrive sooner if one accepts a compromise. Mandela understood that each small compromise accumulated into a significant trade-off. He did not refuse out of pride, but because he clearly saw the long-term cost. A movement can lose its compass if its symbol drifts from principle. Consistency in small choices kept that compass aligned. Time, once redefined this way, gradually lost its destructive authority. It still passed, still moved slowly, still repeated itself, but it was no longer the absolute jailer. Mandela turned time into a silent ally. Each year that passed without breaking him was proof that prison had failed at its deepest objective. That proof, though unpublished, accumulated moral weight. On another level, imprisonment also exposed the fragility of power. A system that must confine a single person for decades in order to preserve its order is not a stable system. Mandela did not need to say this. Time spoke for him. Each year he retained dignity, made the legitimacy of apartheid harder for the outside world to ignore. In retrospect, the trial of time was not only for the prisoner, it was for society itself. Would society have the patience to confront the delayed truth? Would it accept that moral problems cannot be solved by postponement? Prison tried to turn time into a sedative. Mandela turned time into an inescapable lesson. And then, across those long years, something else began to take shape. Quietly, unofficially, tentative contacts, ambiguous signals from outside suggested that the system, too, was growing weary. When both sides are tested by time, the door to dialogue can begin to open, not because goodwill suddenly appears, but because stalemate is no longer sustainable. From the steady darkness of prison, the story moves toward another chapter, one of exile, fleeting encounters with equality, and an uncomfortable question. When freedom arrives as a negotiation, can it still be entirely free? There are journeys not undertaken to discover something new, but to see, perhaps for the first time, what should have existed all along. For Frederick Douglass, his years of exile in Europe were not an escape for rest, but a subtle collision with another possibility of life, the possibility of being treated as an ordinary human being. Ordinary in this sense was so rare as to be disorienting. After his voice grew strong enough to make the institution of slavery feel threatened, the danger of being captured again hung over him like a shadow. Leaving the United States, Douglass stepped into a different space, one where skin color did not immediately assign a person to a fixed rung of the social ladder. In England and Ireland, he walked the streets without being watched, entered meeting halls without having to justify his presence, and spoke in public without needing permission to be considered an exception. There were no grand ceremonies of welcome, only simple normalcy, and it was precisely that simplicity that proved shocking. This brief glimpse of equality did not arrive as a triumph. It came as an exhale. When the body no longer had to tense itself in anticipation, the mind began to realize how long it had lived in contraction. Douglas sensed something challenging to put into words. Dignity is not a reward granted after one proves worth. It is the starting point. In this place, he did not need to suffer in order to be heard. He only needed to speak, and his words were received for their substance. The psychological impact of this experience was profound. It stripped away a dangerous myth implanted by slavery into the minds of the oppressed, that degradation is natural. When Douglas was treated as an equal, it did not make him into someone else. It simply revealed who he had always been. Normalcy thus became living proof that injustice is not a biological destiny, but a political choice maintained by habit and interest. Exile, however, was not paradise. It carried the loneliness of someone standing between two worlds. In Europe, Douglas saw what could be. In America, he knew what was. That distance was both comforting and agonizing. For once you have seen another version of life, you cannot return and pretend that the old cage was inevitable. Equality, even when fleeting, poses a question that cannot be avoided. If this can exist here, why not at home? There was a pivotal moment during his exile that revealed the complexity of freedom. European friends, concerned for Douglas's safety, raised money to purchase his legal freedom, a transaction meant to sever the threat of re-enslavement. The act sprang from goodwill, yet carried a bitter paradox. Freedom, which should have been an inherent right, arrived in the form of a commodity. When the papers were signed, Douglas did not celebrate. He reflected. That reflection was not a rejection of kindness, but an act of moral honesty. What happens when freedom is bought? Does it liberate a system, or merely an individual? Douglas understood that the transaction could protect him, but it did not touch the heart of the problem. If freedom could be purchased for one person, then millions of others remained bound by the same inhuman market logic. That moment clarified his resolve, not to stop at personal safety, but to return and confront the very system that had turned freedom into merchandise. Exile thus became a distinctive moral classroom. It taught Douglas that equality is not a feeling, but a social structure. One may feel respected in one place, but if the structures elsewhere remain intact, that feeling is temporary. The normalcy he experienced did not satisfy him. It sharpened him. It gave him a standard against which to measure the falseness of familiar justifications, that society is not ready, that people are not capable, that change takes time. In Europe, Douglas also witnessed the power of international solidarity. When a story crosses borders, it is no longer trapped in domestic disputes. Moral pressure multiplies, not through force, but through the public shame of an order that claims to be civilized. Yet he harbored no illusions. Pressure from outside only matters when it connects to action from within. Exile gave him the distance needed to see America clearly, and a reason strong enough to return. Another change unfolded quietly. Exile helped Douglas recalibrate his voice. In a place where he did not need to remain on guard, his speech grew more precise, less reactive, more analytical. He no longer spoke only to refute. He talked to construct a broader picture. This composure did not soften him. It sharpened him. When he returned, his voice carried a new authority, the authority of someone who had seen that an alternative truly existed. The glimpse of equality, therefore, was not a reward. It was a responsibility. The responsibility to return, to face danger, and to continue speaking, not with blind anger, but with the certainty of a standard that had been verified. Douglas returned not to say that Europe was better, but to say that America could be better if it dared to dismantle the power structures distorting its own ideals. Within the larger narrative, Douglas's exile mirrors Mandela's imprisonment. One man is removed from society to test time. The other is placed outside it to test standards. Both learn the same lesson from opposite directions. Freedom is not durable if it remains merely a personal experience. It must be anchored in structure, in law, in collective memory, and in responsibility toward those who cannot yet step outside. And when Douglas returned, a new burden emerged. The burden not only of speaking, but of carrying a family, of protecting fragile bonds against the system's subtle reprisals. The cost of conviction does not stop with the individual. It spreads to those most deeply loved. From here, the story moves into another depth of sacrifice, where imprisonment seeks victory, not through limestone and salt wind, but by severing the emotional ties that have kept a person upright. There is a quiet victory every oppressive system longs to achieve. Not the surrender of ideals, but the exhaustion of the human spirit through love itself. When prison cannot bend the will, it seeks a detour through family, through the most fragile ties that anchor a person to ordinary life. For Nelson Mandela, the cost of faith in justice was measured not only in years of imprisonment, but in the irreparable absences carved into family life. 27 years of confinement were not merely the absence of a father from a household. They were an absence prolonged and repeated until it became a new usual, an unspoken lack that everyone learned to endure, yet no one ever truly accepted. Mandela's children grew up with an image of their father more present in imagination than in memory. Letters arrived late, censored, their brief lines carrying an entire life compressed into fragments. Fatherhood under such conditions was not sustained by daily gestures, but by the fragile belief that this absence meant something. Prison understood this well. It is understood that human beings can endure physical pain, but falter when confronted with the suffering of those they love. Rare, brief visits, conducted under watchful eyes, were not meant to connect, but to remind. Power can reach anywhere. A glance through glass, a hurried touch, each carried a wordless message. Your choices have consequences, and those consequences do not fall on you alone. For Mandela, the most significant challenge was not maintaining political resolve, but keeping his heart from closing. Resentment is an understandable reflex when one's family pays the price for a struggle they did not choose. Yet he knew that if personal pain hardened into bitterness, the prison would have won in the deepest way possible. For then it would not merely confine the body, but reconfigure the inner life according to the logic of violence. Mandela's resilience lay in his refusal to take the easier path. Allowed himself to feel pain, but not to shut down. He let tenderness exist alongside discipline, longing alongside restraint. In the harshest conditions, he still sought to preserve small acts of care, asking after loved ones, listening, reminding them that the bond of family remained, even when stretched to the point of breaking. Still, the cost was paid, day by day, year by year. Ordinary moments Birthdays, graduations, crucial decisions passed without a father's presence. The Mandela family did not merely live in absence. They lived in prolonged waiting, a future perpetually deferred. It was another form of exile, without bars, yet no less heavy. This sacrifice posed an unavoidable moral question. Is there any justice vast enough to justify the suffering of the most innocent? Mandela did not evade that question. He carried it as a necessary burden, not to punish himself, but to remember responsibility. The struggle for him was never an abstraction. It was always bound to specific faces, specific relationships, losses that could never be restored. That awareness kept his ideals from sliding into extremism. For when one understands the cost, one becomes more cautious in calling others to sacrifice. At a deeper level, Mandela's family story exposes a universal mechanism of oppressive power. When it cannot openly destroy ideals, it erodes the emotional foundations that sustain them. Family becomes a second battlefield. Yet it is precisely here that a quiet form of resistance unfolds. The Mandela family's endurance, their continued love, their continued waiting, was not submission, but a refusal to let fear dictate the totality of life. The burden on the family, therefore, is not only a story of loss. It is a story of human limits and of choosing to believe despite knowing the cost. That faith is not blind. It is built on the sober recognition that without those willing to pay a price, unjust structures would stand forever. Yet it also carries a warning. Every political decision has human consequences, and no victory is truly whole if those consequences are forgotten. In the slow-breathing rhythm of this narrative, family emerges as the anchor that prevents the struggle from drifting into cold abstraction. It reminds us that freedom is measured not only by laws or constitutions, but by the ability to live fully within the most intimate human bonds. Mandela emerged from prison not as an unscarred man, but as one who had carried his wounds through a long arc of history, so that he would not pass them on to others in the form of revenge. And from that burden, another capacity gradually took shape, the capacity for dialogue. Having seen the cost of prolonged confrontation, having understood how far fear and loss can spread, the search for another path begins, not to erase the past, but to prevent its repetition. From cold visiting rooms and years of separation, the story moves into a new space, where former adversaries begin to sit together, carrying painful memories, yet also a fragile hope, to dismantle chains without creating more divided families. There are moments in history when struggle leaves the streets, leaves the prison cell, and enters quiet rooms where power is spoken in titles and signatures. For Frederick Douglass, that moment came when he stepped into the White House to talk to Abraham Lincoln, not as a supplicant, but as a conscience knocking on the door of authority. Douglass did not come to Washington with the illusion that a single conversation could dismantle an entire system. He understood the nature of political power all too well. It operates through calculation, pressure, and compromises that are rarely spoken aloud. Yet precisely because he understood this, he knew that without a clear moral voice, sounding within the center of power, every calculation would drift toward the safest option, and safety in wartime often means postponing justice. In its early years, the American Civil War was not unequivocally named a war for emancipation. It was framed as a struggle to preserve the Union. For Lincoln, national unity was a matter of survival. For Douglass, that truth was insufficient. A union preserved without freeing human beings would merely be a stronger cage. He entered the White House with that understanding, carrying not only the experience of someone once enslaved, but the responsibility of a historical witness. The meetings between Douglas and Lincoln were not theatrical displays of oratory. They took place under the pressure of war, where each decision could alter the course of events. Douglas spoke plainly, sometimes uncomfortably so. He pointed out that hesitation over abolishing slavery was not prudent neutrality, but a moral choice with consequences. Each day of delay was another day the system of oppression continued to regard itself as legitimate. What gave weight to Douglas's voice was not outrage, but consistency. He came neither to flatter Lincoln nor to indict him personally. He asked a deeper question about the purpose of the war itself. If blood was being shed, if the nation was being torn apart, was that price being paid to preserve an empty political structure or to give birth to a renewed public morality? Douglas forced power to confront the very question it sought to avoid. Lincoln, in these exchanges, did not appear as a flawless hero. He hesitated, calculated, sometimes retreated, but crucially, he listened. He recognized that Douglas represented a force no weapon could silence, the collective conscience of those excluded from the nation's promise. In the tension between these two men, one wielding political power, the other moral authority, history began to shift. When Douglas pressed Lincoln to allow the enlistment of black soldiers, it was not merely a tactical request. It was a declaration of citizenship. A nation cannot demand sacrifice without acknowledging dignity. Allowing black men to bear arms for the Union meant recognizing them as part of it. Here, ethics and strategies intersected with unmistakable clarity. Lincoln gradually came to see that the war could not end in any durable way without resting on a new moral foundation. The Emancipation Proclamation did not emerge from nothing. It was the result of pressure from many directions: battlefields, public opinion, and especially voices like Douglas's, voices that would not permit power to evade the question of human worth. Douglas did not write the document, but he helped create the moral space in which it could exist. In later meetings, the relationship between the two men took on a different tone. The initial tension gave way to mutual recognition. Lincoln came to see Douglas not merely as an activist, but as an honest measure of what the nation still owed. Douglas came to see Lincoln not simply as a president, but as a man learning to carry the weight of history. Respect did not erase their differences, but it allowed dialogue to continue. For Douglas, entering the White House was not a sign of victory, but of a new responsibility. Once a voice reaches the center of power, it can no longer merely protest. It must demand accountability. He understood that the greatest danger now was not public defeat, but quiet compromise, when grand ideals are worn down into vague clauses. And so he continued to serve as conscience, even when doing so made him uncomfortable to many. The story of dialogue with Lincoln reveals a central truth of all struggles. Power rarely corrects itself unless it is illuminated. Conscience does not replace policy, but it orients it. When conscience enters the meeting room, history gains the chance to turn, slowly, imperfectly, but at least with awareness of the cost of delay. And as the Civil War moved toward its conclusion, the question arose in a new form: if slavery were abolished, what would follow? Dialogue with Lincoln opened the first door, but that door led into a longer corridor where the nation would have to examine its promise to those newly freed. Elsewhere, in Another era, another moral voice was preparing to step into the center of power, not to ask for new promises, but to remind the world that the old ones remained unfulfilled. And that is the breathing rhythm of the next part. There are forms of power that require neither whips nor iron bars. They operate through delay, through promises repeated just enough to soothe, and through a calm voice that constantly insists, "The time is not yet ripe." This is the power of polite denial. And it was with this form of power that Martin Luther King Jr. entered into dialogue, not as a loud challenger, but as the patient conscience of a nation reassuring itself. King did not come to Washington in the posture of a petitioner seeking favors. He came as one who reminded the nation of a promise written long before in the founding documents of the United States: freedom, equality, human rights. These concepts were not foreign to political power. What was foreign was their consistent and unconditional implementation. In his meetings with John F. Kennedy, and later with Lyndon B. Johnson, King did not bring new slogans. He got a comparison between words and reality. Denying power rarely says no. It says not yet. Not enough consensus, not enough stability, not politically convenient. King understood this psychological mechanism with great clarity. He knew that prolonged delay can render pain invisible, and when pain is no longer seen, it is easily assumed to have been resolved. So he chose a different strategy. He refused to let power forget. He turned collective memory into a continuous moral pressure, gentle but unrelenting. In closed meeting rooms, King spoke in a calm voice, almost devoid of personal accusation. He did not attack the president. He attacked the gap between speeches about freedom and the daily lives of Black Americans. The gap between democratic promises and the long lines at polling stations where people were turned away. That gap, King argued, was not a technical error, but a moral problem, and morality, once placed on the table, cannot be treated as a minor agenda item. What made King the conscience of the nation was not his oratory before massive crowds, though he was renowned for it, but his ability to maintain the same voice in every setting. Before hundreds of thousands or before a president, he said the same thing with the same moral cadence. That consistency unsettled power, for power can negotiate policy, but it struggles to deal with an unchanging moral standard. King also understood that dialogue does not mean unprincipled compromise. He did not enter the center of power to ease tensions through silence. On the contrary, he carried pressure from the outside. Peaceful demonstrations, images of injustice broadcast across the country, and placed them on the negotiating table. This was a strategic combination: dialogue inside, pressure outside. One reminded of the power of its responsibility. The other reminded the public that delay itself is a form of violence. In his relationship with Kennedy, King faced a power that hesitated, caught between personal ideals and political calculation. Johnson faced a more pragmatic power, willing to act, but only when pressure became sufficient. King harbored no illusions about political motives. He did not ask leaders to become perfect moral figures. He asked them to be accountable to the principles they claimed to represent. This distinction mattered deeply. King did not seek heroes. He sought structural movement. As the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act gradually took shape, King did not celebrate as though the struggle were complete. He clearly saw the danger of a nation persuading itself that the problem had been solved simply because laws had been signed. For him, law was a necessary condition, not a sufficient one. Power might cease its denial on paper, but more subtle forms of denial could continue in economics, education, and everyday life. Therefore, the voice of conscience could not fall silent after legal victory. At a deeper level, King's dialogue with denying power reveals an important psychological lesson. Lasting change rarely comes from immediate shame, but from persistence that makes it impossible for power to look away. King did not shame the nation through condemnation. He unsettled it by reminding it that its moral identity was suspended. America, in King's mirror, saw itself, not as a purely evil entity, but as a community unwilling to fully live up to its own promise. The role of conscience, therefore, is a lonely one. It offers no immediate gratification. It requires its bearer to accept being misunderstood, being urged to be more patient, being advised to wait another term, another election, a more convenient moment. King heard all of these counsels and answered with a simple truth. Justice delayed is justice denied. The calmness of his voice did not conceal urgency. It made that urgency impossible to dismiss. In retrospect, King's dialogue with denying power did more than produce legislation. It established a new standard for the relationship between morality and politics. He showed that every nation needs individuals willing to stand at that uncomfortable boundary, not entirely outside, where they can be ignored, and not entirely inside, where they can be absorbed. At that boundary, conscience has a chance to intervene. And when the doors of power finally begin to open, another test appears. Dialogue, however successful, is only a phase. After laws, after signatures, a more complex question emerges: how to live together after confrontation. On another continent, a man newly released from a long imprisonment is preparing for an even more fragile dialogue, one not only with power, but with those who were once direct enemies. From the conscience of a nation, the story moves toward the art of sitting down with the other side, where reconciliation is not forgetting, but choosing not to reproduce violence. There are moments in history when violence is no longer an effective language, yet the memory of violence still carries its full weight. In such moments, the greatest challenge is not to win, but to prevent victory from becoming another cycle of hatred. After long years of imprisonment, Nelson Mandela entered a different phase of struggle, one more difficult, quieter, and demanding a severe discipline of the inner life, sitting down with those who had once imprisoned him. South Africa at that time stood at a fragile crossroads. On one side was anger accumulated over generations, powerful enough to incinerate any call for restraint. On the other hand was the deep fear of the former ruling group, fear of losing privilege, fear of retribution, fear of a future they could no longer control. Mandela understood that if these two fears collided through violence, the country would slide into civil war. Negotiation, therefore, was not a weak option. It was the only option to avert catastrophe. Mandela's art of negotiation did not begin at the conference table. It started with how he saw people. He refused to reduce his opponents to abstract villains. He saw them as individuals trapped inside a collapsing system, panicked by the prospect of being treated according to the very logic they had once imposed. Recognizing that fear was not a way of excusing injustice, it was a way of neutralizing the defensive reflex that causes dialogue to collapse before it begins. Mandela held to a clear principle: no compromise on the goal, flexibility on the path. The goal was non-negotiable: an end to apartheid, universal suffrage, and legal equality. but the route to those ends had to be designed so that the other side could enter without feeling cornered. He understood that when people believe they have no exit, they will choose destruction over concession. In private contacts, Mandela spoke less and listened more. This listening was not capitulation. It was the gathering of psychological intelligence. He wanted to know what his counterparts feared most, what changes they could tolerate, and where their current limits lay. Negotiation, in this approach, was a map of fear, and the skilled negotiator was the one who could redraw that map, so fear no longer set the direction. Language was another decisive element. Mandela avoided humiliating rhetoric and resisted reopening the past in ways that forced the other side into denial. He did not demand immediate public confessions of guilt. He asked them to join in dismantling a system that had become impossible to sustain. The distinction was subtle but decisive. It shifted the focus from blame to responsibility, from an unchangeable past to a future that had to be built. Negotiation, of course, did not occur in a vacuum. Mandela was always aware that his leverage came from pressure outside the room, from the movement, from the steadfastness of the masses, from the real risk of instability if progress stalled. He did not trade that strength for politeness. Instead, he used it as a silent anchor, allowing the negotiating table to become a place where pressure could be translated into new structures. Negotiation thus became a bridge between the energy of the streets and the language of institutions. There were moments when the process seemed close to collapse. Violence flared outside, fragile trust was tested, and calls for revenge grew louder. In those moments, Mandela chose deliberate slowness. He refused to react to the tempo of anger. He kept the rhythm of a longer vision, reminding all sides that every word spoken then could shape the memory of an entire nation for decades to come. The most challenging aspect of sitting down with the enemy is accepting that justice does not arrive as a complete moment. It comes in layers, in steps, and often carries a sense of insufficiency. Mandela accepted that insufficiency not because he lowered the standard of justice, but because he prioritized the survival of the community. Peace is not forgetting. Peace is creating conditions in which memory no longer reproduces violence. From a psychological perspective, Mandela's negotiation was a lesson in self-mastery. The man who had suffered the most became the one with the strictest emotional discipline. He did not allow the past to dictate every decision, but neither did he permit the present to erase the past. This balance between remembering and releasing formed the foundation of reconciliation. It allowed people to face one another without being suffocated by memory, while still preserving essential moral boundaries. As agreements gradually took shape, a paradox emerged. The success of negotiation depended on it not being experienced as a victory for either side. If one party felt defeated, peace would only be temporary. Mandela understood this and was careful with every symbol, every gesture. He spoke of we more than I, of a shared future more than past a right and wrong. That language did not erase injustice. It opened a path for injustice to be dismantled without triggering a reflex of destruction. The art of negotiation, in the end, is not a technique of persuasion, but an ethics of patience. It requires those who practice it to endure being misunderstood by both sides, distrusted by former supporters, and regarded warily by former enemies. Mandela accepted that solitude as part of the role. He knew that if no one was willing to stand in this uncomfortable middle ground, history would choose the easier road, and the easier route is usually violence. As the country moved closer to free elections, a new question quietly surfaced. What comes after negotiation? New laws, new institutions, but old memories remained. How does a society live with truth without letting truth divide it once again? From the art of sitting down with the enemy, the story moves toward a bolder moral experiment, creating a space where truth can be spoken not to punish, but to heal. And that is the breath of the next part. When the chains are removed, silence often arrives before freedom. Not the silence of peace, but the emptiness of unanswered questions. For Frederick Douglass, the moment after emancipation was not the conclusion of a struggle, but the beginning of a far more complex trial. How to transform legal freedom into lived freedom. He understood that abolishing slavery was a necessary condition, but it was never a sufficient one. After the Civil War, America reassured itself with a sense of completion. A brutal system had collapsed. That, it believed, was enough. But Douglass immediately saw the cracks in that self-congratulatory narrative. Freedom, if defined only as the absence of chains, would soon be replaced by more subtle forms of control. Public whips were gone, but systemic poverty remained. So did the lack of education and ambiguous laws that rendered citizenship fragile. Douglass's question, what comes after, was not meant to diminish the value of emancipation, but to protect it from being hollowed out. He stated plainly that freedom could not endure if people lacked the means to exercise it. The right to vote means little when voting is obstructed. The right to work means little when labor is suffocated by the absence of land and capital. Legal rights mean little when the law is not enforced fairly. Freedom, in this sense, is an ecosystem. Remove one link and the entire structure weakens. In the years following the war, Douglass persistently emphasized education as a foundation. Not education for assimilation, but education for empowerment. He understood that knowledge does more than open individual opportunity. It creates collective capacity to defend against new forms of oppression. When people possess the language to name injustice, injustice can no longer hide easily behind legitimate procedures. Education, therefore, became a form of democratic security. Yet even as he stressed education and citizenship, Douglass saw a more profound contradiction: economics. A society may proclaim legal equality, but if its economic structure continues to reproduce inequality, that proclamation will steadily lose meaning. He warned that political freedom without economic justice becomes a promissory note without funds. People may be permitted to dream, but lack the tools to turn those dreams into life. Decades later, Martin Luther King Jr. would repeat the same question in a different language, in a different context. When civil rights legislation was passed, America once again exhaled in relief. But King, like Douglass before him, refused to let the nation stop at the feeling of completion. He spoke of freedom as a check, long since written, but repeatedly returned, marked insufficient funds. For him, legal equality without economic justice was merely a postponement of a moral debt. King understood that poverty is a form of bondage without chains. It restricts choice, erodes dignity, and turns freedom into theory. That is why he expanded the vision of the civil rights movement toward questions of opportunity, jobs, housing, health care. This expansion did not dilute the ideal. It made it concrete. Freedom was no longer a slogan, but the capacity to live a life not crushed by systemic deprivation. Notably, both Douglass and King encountered the same response: calls for patience. Patience with the process, patience with the market, patience with politics. But they recognize that patience, when unevenly distributed, becomes a privilege. Those who benefit from the existing order can afford patience. Those harmed by it cannot. Thus, the question of what comes after is also a question of time. Who is allowed to wait, and who must continue to pay the price during that waiting? At a deeper level, this question forces society to confront memory. The abolition of slavery or the passage of laws does not automatically erase history. The memory of injustice, if unacknowledged and unaddressed, continues to shape the present through indirect paths. Douglas and King both warned against the danger of surface progress, when symbols change faster than structures and society confuses improved appearances with substantive change. Therefore, what comes after is not a fixed list of policies, but a sustained moral posture. It requires society to continually examine the gap between proclamation and reality, between law and lived experience. It demands the courage to recognize that historic achievements can become fragile, if not nourished by long-term responsibility. Freedom in this understanding is a process, not an event. There is a shared rhythm in the arguments of Douglas and King, widening the circle. Each advance has meaning only if it expands the range of those who benefit, rather than freezing privilege within a new group. When emancipation stops at a boundary, it creates new boundaries. When freedom becomes the property of the few, it loses the moral foundation that gave it birth. From a distance, the question, what comes after, can sound exhausting, as though history allows no rest. Yet within that fatigue lies a quiet truth. Societies progress only when they accept that justice has no final finish line. Each generation inherits an unfulfilled promise, and its responsibility is not to declare completion, but to carry that promise a little further, with fewer exclusions, fewer conditions. And when that question resounds after the abolition of slavery, it also echoes after every other legal victory. It prepares the ground for an even more difficult phase: reconstruction. From dismantling chains to building institutions just enough that memory no longer reproduces injustice. Elsewhere, a nation that has just crossed the threshold of free elections is attempting a daring path to face its past, not to punish, but to heal. And that is the breath that carries us into the next part. There are victories measured by the number of votes, and there are victories that must be measured by the capacity to live together after the victory. When South Africa held its first free election, the moment a ballot was cast did more than close a political era. It opened a far more difficult moral problem. For Nelson Mandela, becoming president did not mean the nation had been healed. A ballot can change leadership, but memory does not disappear with the end of a term. Mandela understood the fragility of this moment with great clarity. A society emerging from prolonged oppression carries two parallel currents: a hunger for justice and a reservoir of compressed anger. If anger alone is satisfied, the country risks sliding into revenge. If forgetting alone is encouraged, wounds will fester in silence. Rebuilding a nation, therefore, could not be limited to rewriting a constitution or reshaping institutions. It had to be an inner construction, one in which memory was appropriately placed so that it would no longer generate violence. From this awareness emerged a bold moral experiment, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This was not a court in the familiar sense. It did not prioritize punishment, nor did it promise to erase the past. Its purpose was to bring truth into the open, not to humiliate, but to dismantle the culture of denial that had sustained injustice for decades. When truth is spoken, it hurts. When it is buried, it poisons. The Commission created an unprecedented space. Victims were given the opportunity to tell their stories publicly, and perpetrators were offered the chance to confess in exchange for conditional amnesty. This structure posed an uncomfortable question to both sides. For victims, could one endure hearing the truth without a proportionate sentence? For perpetrators, could one face one's own memory under the gaze of the community? Reconciliation in this approach was not gentle. It was a form of moral labor that demanded courage from everyone involved. Mandela supported the TRC not because he undervalued justice, but because he understood the limits of punitive justice in this context. A comprehensive system of punishment might satisfy short-term emotion, but it also risks repolarizing society, turning memory into a new political weapon. The reconciliation pursued by the TRC did not deny responsibility. It transformed how responsibility was enacted, from punishment to acknowledgement, from silence to speech. At a psychological level, the TRC recognized a truth often overlooked. People need to be heard in order to begin letting go. When victims are allowed to speak, their suffering is no longer questioned. When perpetrators confess, denial, the adhesive that held the old system together, is broken. This process does not erase loss, but it prevents loss from continuing to serve as justification for new violence. Reconciliation, therefore, functions as a mechanism of non-recurrence. Of course, there was no universal consensus. Some viewed the TRC as too lenient. Others felt it did not go far enough. Mandela accepted these dissatisfactions as the cost of a difficult choice. He understood that nation-building is not about achieving universal satisfaction, but about establishing conditions in which disagreement does not lead to collapse. The TRC was not a perfect answer. It was a workable one in a fragile moment. What mattered most was that the TRC placed memory at the center of politics, not to imprison the future in the past, but to free the future from a distorted past. When memory is shared publicly, it becomes a collective asset rather than a private obsession. The nation begins to learn how to remember together instead of remembering against one another. This is a subtle but decisive shift, from fragmented history to a history capable of dialogue. In the slow rhythm of this process, Mandela consistently emphasized the symbolism of disciplined forgiveness. He appeared alongside former adversaries, chose shared language, and avoided gestures of humiliation, not to soothe guilt, but to keep the process aligned with its purpose. Rebuilding a nation, for him, was the art of maintaining balance between memory and future, between the truth that must be spoken and the life that must continue. There is a profound lesson in this journey, from the ballot to reconciliation. Democracy does not end with elections. Elections transfer power. Reconciliation lays the foundation. Without a moral foundation, new power can reproduce old injustices in different forms. The TRC, therefore, was not merely a program. It was a principle that a nation matures when it dares to face itself. Viewed more broadly, South Africa's story echoes the questions once posed by Douglas and King in other contexts. What comes after legal victory? The answer does not lie in a universal formula, but in a willingness to invest in processes that are slow, emotionally costly, and largely devoid of spectacle. Reconciliation does not produce instant images of triumph. It makes the possibility of long-term coexistence. When the TRC concluded its hearings, there was no sense of complete closure, and that was appropriate. Reconciliation is not a period, it is an extended comma, reminding us that the work of nation-building is never finished. Yet from that comma, another light began to emerge. The lesson of power that knows how to let go. When a leader chooses to step aside at the right moment, returning space to institutions, reconciliation gains the chance to take deeper root. From the ballot to reconciliation, South Africa learned how to pass through victory without being made arrogant by it. And it is precisely here that the story prepares to move into its final rhythm, where legacy is no longer measured by titles or terms, but by the capacity to relinquish power so that the future does not depend on a single individual. There is a quiet paradox in the history of power. Those who hold it the longest rarely leave behind the most enduring legacy. That legacy often belongs to those who know when to step away. For Nelson Mandela, the final lesson of leadership was not written in decrees, but in a decision that appeared almost simple: serving only one term and then withdrawing. In a world accustomed to measuring power by the length of time it is held, that act of letting go resonated like a declaration. Mandela understood that power, when grasped too tightly, begins to change its nature. It shifts from a means into an end, from a responsibility into an identity. When that happens, a nation becomes inadvertently tethered to a single face, and the future grows dependent on the continued presence of that individual. He did not want South Africa to enter that trajectory, after a long history in which power had been used to exclude. He chose to use power to impose limits on itself, to return space to institutions so they could mature. The decision to step aside was not an act of avoidance. It was courage of a different kind, the courage to accept that no one is indispensable. Mandela clearly saw the temptation to remain, the affection of the public, the desire for stability after transition, the familiar rhythm of the role. But he also saw the danger of staying, the invisible delay in institutional development, where every decision waits for the leader to pronounce it. Letting go, in this context, was the fastest way to shift power away from the individual. From the perspective of leadership psychology, this was a counter-current move. People often bind their sense of worth to their position. Leaving that position can feel like losing meaning itself. Mandela chose to separate the two. He demonstrated that the value of leadership does not lie in the chair, but in whether the chair continues to function well once the leader stands up. That's self-mastery. The ability not to equate oneself with power is rare, and for that reason, profoundly instructive. Letting go also carried a moral message. Power is not a reward for the past, but a loan from the present to the future. It is entrusted to be used, not possessed. When the task has been completed to a necessary degree, returning power becomes part of the responsibility. Mandela did not step aside in crisis. He stepped aside at the height of his credibility. That timing made the act persuasive because it could not be read as a failure or retreat. There was a vital ripple effect from this decision. When the highest leader imposes limits on himself, lower levels have reason to follow. Political culture begins to shift from personality to process, from dependence to succession. Institutions are encouraged to develop independent capacity rather than waiting for direction from a single center. Letting go, therefore, does not weaken the state. It strengthens it. The decision was also a reminder of the nature of reconciliation itself. If reconciliation is bound to a single symbol, it remains fragile. When that symbol departs, reconciliation must be strong enough to continue. Mandela gave South Africa that chance. The chance to prove that what had been achieved did not depend on his continuous presence. It was a difficult but necessary test, ensuring that the past would not return in the form of personal veneration. In the slow cadence of history, letting go was also a way for Mandela to protect himself from the vortex of power. He preserved his inner life from erosion by ritual and pressure. By leaving office, he returned to the role of citizen, still listened to, but no longer responsible for deciding everything. This shift allowed him to maintain a moral voice without being dissolved into the daily compromises of governance. The lesson here extends beyond politics. It speaks to every form of leadership, within families, organizations, and communities. When leaders know how to let go, they create space for others to grow. When that space opens, collective capacity has a chance to form. Power in this understanding is an art of distribution, not accumulation. Of course, letting go does not guarantee that everything will proceed smoothly. Mandela was not naive about the challenges ahead, but he placed his wager on a principle: a society matures only when it learns to function without reliance on an irreplaceable individual. That trust in people, in institutions, in process, is the deep foundation of sustainable democracy. Looking back, the single-term decision becomes the point where the entire journey crystallizes. From struggle to dialogue, to reconciliation, to construction. It functions like the final rest in a long piece of music, not loud, but clarifying the central melody. Power, if it does not know how to let go, will betray its original purpose. Power, when it does know how to let go, can become a gift returned to the future. And from that lesson, the story prepares to enter its final rhythm, where attention shifts away from individuals and institutions toward the moral compass these lives have left behind. As the night deepens, the remaining question is no longer who prevailed, but what we will carry into tomorrow, so that freedom is not merely a memory, but a way of living that is passed on. When a story reaches its final passage, history no longer needs to speak loudly. It lowers its voice, slows its pace, and allows the most essential things to find their place in silence. In this moment, there are no more milestones to conquer, no more slogans to debate. What remains is a gentle, yet persistent question. Amid a turbulent world, what will guide us when power, interest, and fear pull each person in different directions? If such a compass exists, it is not forged from metal or maps. It is honed from the lived experience of those who have gone to the very edge of oppression without losing their dignity. Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King Jr., and Nelson Mandela did not leave us a closed formula. They left us a direction, a way of asking questions about power, about freedom, and about our responsibility to one another. That compass tells us that freedom is not something achieved and then stored away. It is a capacity that must be exercised daily. Douglass began from zero, no name, no history, and showed that dignity can be rebuilt through knowledge and steadfastness. He reminded us that when a society strips a person of their past, it is attempting to seize their future. Douglass's compass, therefore, always points toward memory. Remembering so as not to be controlled, remembering so as to know what must change. King carried that compass into the public space of a modern nation. He understood that morality, if it does not enter politics, will be isolated. But politics, if not illuminated by morality, will slide into endless delay. King's compass points to the gap, the gap between promise and reality, and demands that we measure that distance not with vague patience, but with concrete action. He lulled us with a calm cadence to remind us that justice delayed is justice denied. Mandela brought that compass to another continent, where the question was not only how to end oppression, but how to prevent victory from becoming the seed of new violence. His compass points toward a shared future, where memory is acknowledged but not weaponized, where power is used to limit itself, and where reconciliation is understood as sustained labor rather than ritual. He lulled the world with the hardest lesson of all. Knowing when to let go is also a form of leadership. These three directions, memory, distance, and a shared future, come together to form a moral compass simple enough to carry and rigorous enough not to be bent by convenience. It does not guarantee that we will always choose correctly. It guarantees only that when we lose our way, we have a means of return, to ask whether a choice expands or narrows human dignity, reduces violence or reproduces it, distributes power or hoards it. In the present, where information is dense and judgment moves faster than thought, that compass is all the more necessary. It reminds us that a loud voice is not the same as a true one, that quick victories are not the same as lasting ones, and that comfortable silence sometimes conceals injustices being quietly normalized. History's lullaby does not rock us to sleep before reality. It soothes us so we are less afraid, calm enough to look directly, and gentle enough not to lose our moral boundaries. That compass also teaches a lesson about the individual. Each person, even without great power, still holds the power of choice in small moments, choosing to listen rather than deny, to ask rather than assume, to make room rather than take it. Those small choices, repeated, create the moral climate of a community. It is that climate that determines whether freedom will flourish or wither. As the night deepens, perhaps the most incredible comfort is realizing that we do not begin from nothing. Before us, there were people who went very far to show that power can be challenged without destruction, that dialogue can occur without forgetting, and that letting go can strengthen rather than weaken the future. Their compass does not compel, it invites. And so this final lullaby does not end with a command, but with a gentle reminder. Carry the compass when you are weary, use it when you doubt your worth, and pass it on when you have the chance to expand dignity for another. History does not ask us to be heroes. It asks only that we not turn away from the right question when it appears. And if at times you feel alone for choosing what is right in a noisy world, remember that the moral compass works best in silence. It does not need a crowd to point the way. It requires a heart quiet enough to listen. As you rest your head on the pillow tonight, let this lullaby remain as a soft promise. Tomorrow, wherever you go, you will still know the path back to what we call dignity. Not as a distant ideal, but as a way of living that can be practiced, step by unhurried step in the present.